Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Perspective Philosophy, where we try to better our perceptions of the world through philosophical discussion. I'm here with Darren. Darren is a analytic, I believe, reads a lot of analytic philosophy, and is a moral realist and a vegan, and decided to come on the channel, because I had a little chat on in the YouTube comment section, actually, and he was recommended by one of my viewers. He also seems to be very well read in philosophy and have some pretty interesting arguments for moral realism and in particular veganism. So it will overall benefit the community who are interested in arguing for veganism in a way that isn't the typical non-cognitivist axiomatic view. So Darren, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'll be more than happy to. Please excuse if there is any background noise coming through. But yeah, I am a student of psychology and data science, currently enrolled in a bachelor's degree in it. I have studied philosophy as an autodidact for about 3 years, and my special interest is in the general problem of skepticism and its contingencies. So whenever I go ahead and read a textbook on philosophy, and by the way, I've got pretty much every single introductory textbook that Cambridge University Press has to offer, I go into those textbooks with a purposeful mindset of trying to see how far human knowledge can actually be taken, especially down the road of the problem of skepticism. And it's the most important problem to actually tackle and attempt to solve. Even if we cannot find a solution to the problem of skepticism, its implications on establishing what the true limitations of human knowledge are tremendous for our research methodology. A solution to the problem of skepticism would have massive implications on things like the production of a new type of framework like normative ontology, which would in fact reliably produce something like innovation. So it's extremely important. But I might as well start off by just expressing what my particular philosophical views. So I want to start off with my metaphilosophical views, then move to my metaphysical views, then to my epistemological views, and finally to my ethical views to kind of establish the grounds of what kind of thing you can expect me to talk about as per my beliefs. So my metaphilosophical views are that I'm part of the common sense tradition of philosophy. I'm part of also the analytic tradition. I'm a transcendentalist about the data of philosophy. So that just entails that philosophy is a second order inquiry based research discipline. And all that means is that philosophy studies a particular type of data set that is not material in origin, or not necessarily not material in origin, like there are such cases of things that philosophy studies, like things that are epiphenomenal, like the mind and beliefs, but it's primarily a second order inquiry. I am a stipulativist and a prescriptivist about the products of philosophy. What philosophy you can expect to produce are stipulations, so universals and categoricals, and prescriptions, so principles about human action or prospective action. So I'm also a metaphysical realist and objective representationalist about philosophy's truth aptness, which means that I think that philosophy produces objective representations of how the world really is, and also that it actually derives exact truths about second order properties that comprise the world and lie on the intersection between first order material properties. My metaphysical views are that I'm a Meinongian equivocalist about existence and a univocalist about being. Now, all that entails is that I believe that existence isn't the only type of being. I believe that there is existence, subsistence, and absistence. Of course, existence refers to the material being. Subsistence would refer to non-material being or metaphysical being, which is primarily what philosophy concerns itself with, data-wise. And absistence, which just means is not existent or is not subsistent. And being refers to an allist conception of what is in fact the case in reality, regardless of how it is the case in reality. So I'm also a Finian. So this is what I was talking to you before about, how I was messaging you before about the thick reality operator.
Yep.
So I'm a Finian about quantifier variance. And all that is that the existential quantifier that we use typically in modal or I think predicate logic applies only to particular cases. So particularist cases. So examples of this would be like scientific cases or theoretical physics cases or when we're talking about chemistry, anything like that. And when we branch to universals, which is what philosophy studies, existence becomes a predicate, and a thick reality operator takes its place of the existential quantifier to determine where a category of things, in a philosophical sense, falls on the realist / anti-realist dichotomy. I'm also an Aristotelian universalist about properties. So that is like a realist conception of second order and higher order properties, which is, once again, that's what philosophy studies as opposed to the sciences. I'm a necessitarian universalist about laws. I will delve into that later because that's extremely, extremely important to normative and meta-ethical discussion. I am a hard determinist about causality. I am not a compatibilist because I don't think hard determinism actually runs into any problems whatsoever with regards to determining responsibility. I'm a B theorist about time, but that extends out from my beliefs about Aristotelian universals about properties and my hard determinism. And finally, from my metaphysical views, I'm a dualist, epiphenomenalist, and functionalist about the mind-body relation. So we can also delve into that a little bit more fleshed out way later on. Now, my epistemological views are that I'm a particularist, an internalist, and a foundherentist. So that's the Hackian tradition of justification. And I really do apologize that this is very, very, very fleshed out. I totally understand if it's starting to get like a little bit grating or draining, but it is all in the name of being exhaustive and getting you people to understand where I'm coming from when I do propose the things I propose. Finally, my ethical views are that, one, I'm a utilitarian. I believe in prospective consequentialism, and that is that the right action is the one that best balances risk and good consequence, which holds me to an objective theory of the right thing to do. And it also holds me to the ought implies can principle. Basically, prospective consequentialism is the intersection between subjectivism and objectivism. It says that we hold ourselves to an objective theory of well-being, whilst at the same time, we can only make moral decisions based on our epistemic limitations. So what is moral is not simply determined by what objectively is in the real world, or what is simply subjectively contingent on our mental states. It basically lies on that intersection of like, we can only determine what is moral objectively based on our perspectival limitations. I am a well-being objectivist and a moral realist, which is pretty obvious. And basically that is some things that are good for an individual are good for them independently of their attitude about them. So of course that kind of puts, if I was to still hold to all my positions that I've laid out thus far, that would put me into the position of treating morals as a second order property. So, to say that these second order properties are in fact real. So, and my theory of what is good, of which is that well-being is a second order property lying on the intersection of psychological and biological health. So whatever relates psychological and biological health, that in of itself is my objective theory of well-being. So that's why I hold to. And it's a little bit difficult to outline what it means to have psychological health and what it means to have biological health, but we'll get into that soon. And I'm finally a perfectionist about well-being. And that is, what is good for us is determined by what kinds of things we are fundamentally. And of course, that is exactly that right there. That position right there is what puts me into the position of being a prospectivist. It allows me to remain an objectivist about well-being whilst understanding that morality can only be determined within parameters of our epistemic limitations or perspectival limitations. And when I say fundamentally, I mean fundamentally in relation to moral relevance makers such as sentience. So that would be a case of what is a fundamental thing that allows us to determine what is moral and what is not moral. So with all that being said, I'm sorry if that's taken a long time, but if you want to proceed, more than happy to.
Yeah. Well, I hope that really helps everyone understand where he's coming from. Obviously, he's given you the top-down view where the idea is that he's put the foundations forward for his philosophy, and I think that's good. Normally, it's what we do when we're right. Like, if I'm honest, this is normally how philosophers write. We tend to, especially in continental philosophies, where we'll literally write books like this, where we're like, by the way, this is how the world works. It's very typical that philosophers in analytics as well will link papers to papers that precede their paper. So they're like, okay, well, in this paper, I'm assuming X, Y, and Z before we get started, before we can even talk about what I'm going to talk about. And what he's given you is the lowdown, so that when you do go into it and you want to pull him up for anything, he can then go, okay, well, we're going to talk about metaphysics, or we're going to talk about ontology, and so on like that. So that's fair enough. I think that's fair. Also, I like the suit. Now, if we're going to make this more substantive, because although it is nice to get just a description of your view, I want to see how it holds to criticism. So the typical view that you see, that like most non-cognitives online, so like the people that you'll deal with day to day, you're going to hear J.L. Mackie a lot. Okay, you're going to hear people go, all right, well, moral properties don't exist. What is this metaphysical entity you speak of? This is metaphysically queer. So what would you say is a moral property, and why should I consider it in as good or bad, and evaluate it in these respects?
Okay, so a moral property, if properly conceived as something that falls within the purview of philosophy, according to my conception of philosophy being that philosophy's products are stipulative, so universal, and prescriptive, so principled, then a moral property has to be something that necessarily falls in line with a category. So in the case of moral properties, the only way for perspectives to actually deduce anything along those lines is, I think, through starting with a conceptual analysis of your propositional attitude states, and understanding what they are about before attempting to, I guess, deduce further what necessarily connects our intentional states or our propositional attitude states to what our propositional attitude states are about. An example of this would be, say, for instance, that knowledge, conceived as a second order property, is the necessary connection between beliefs as beliefs relate to reality. And the way that beliefs can relate to reality is through the conception of truth and the mechanism, the intentional mechanism of justification. So there has to be some sort of connection also between justification and truth. I apply this exact same conceptual analysis methodology to other intentional states like well-being and intention, but intention happens to be a subspecies of not well-being, desires. So desires and intentions happen to be a subspecies of desires. So with desires, it's merely another propositional attitude state, but it is ultimately about positive valuation. Now, positive valuation can be split into two categories: hedonistic and perfectionistic. So hedonistic is simply, say, for instance, joy and elation, or what would be the other one? Happiness. And of course, their opposites would be like sadness or misery. Now, there is the other conception of it is perfectionism. So that's ultimately just what people commonly refer to, like, say, for instance, Sam Harris. He refers to it as flourishing. So this is a eudaimonian conception of well-being, and it attempts to be objective. So ultimately, in order to derive a moral property, you need to establish a necessary connection, a relational second-order property that lies on the intersection between one's mental states and what they're about. Now, the difference between the products that you can get from this is stipulative or prescriptive. Now, ethics tends towards prescription, and prescription is derived from starting off with an intentional state that is action urging, and what indispensably defines that intentional state or propositional attitude state, such as desire, happens to be well-being. So you cannot dispense of the positive the necessary positive valuation of well-being. So therefore, because well-being universally defines the category of propositional attitude states, desires, therefore, because desires are action urging, you ought to follow and adhere to what produces well-being. And that doesn't just limit it to one's perspective, because well-being isn't just included in a singular perspective. It holds us necessarily out of pure logical necessity to impartiality. And that, of course, leads to...
Why would you argue that it was logically objective, though? So if I was to say, okay, yeah, I agree that desire is inherently prescriptive and we have to follow our desires, and that's almost an egoistical view. Someone like Ayn Rand would adopt a very similar argument, well, the Art of X, almost, where you say that, yeah, actually, I do have to desire. Anyone that says that they don't is a liar. And I'm being moved forward by my nature.
Yeah.
Now, why should I adhere to someone else's evaluation?
Because it's not
what was the logical imperative?
Okay, so the logical imperative is it's categorical. So whenever there is a desire that means desire, it necessarily falls within the purview of positive valuation and action urging. There is, as far as I've conceived it thus far, and I'll probably actually go back to the drawing board, to be completely honest, to make sure that it's completely sound. I'd probably go down the route of saying that it is prescriptive. That desire in and of itself necessarily only refers, its referent is literally this particular first order mental state, and it is a category. So it is exhaustive of one type of mental state that comprises sentient agents, or and of course there'd be another type that comprises sentient mental states, and that would ultimately be belief. So there are, I'd say, two main categories of mental states. Because it's categorical, there cannot be, I guess, any. Just to put it really simply, I don't think there'd be any contradictions to it. I don't understand what it would mean to say that desire means anything else but that whole action urging positive valuation. It's I would say a kind of basic.
What if I just, sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say, what if I desire, what is it? What does it say in the Old Testament? Do not covet thy neighbor's wife. So let's say I value like somebody else's wife. My girlfriend's looking behind us and she's not too happy. But but let's say I coveted someone's wife. I would say I desired that. Okay. And you would say that my desire wasn't then in fact a desire?
No, not necessarily. Desires themselves are not inherently prescriptive. So, of course, there can be desires that branch without outside of what reliably produces well-being, for the exact same reason that there can be beliefs that branch out of the purview of what reliably breaches truth. It's the exact same deal. When we formulate ethics, we do the exact same thing when we are formulating knowledge. When we're formulating our epistemology, it is essentially the same type of information that we're quantifying over. So there's absolutely zero reason, metaphilosophically, to change up our methods. So when it comes to stipulating our mental states, like say, for instance, desires, we have to understand that, yes, it is relative, but that's relative only in the sense if we're talking about desires as simply like specific types, particular cases that fall within that category. I personally am talking about the category itself, not about contingencies. And that's exactly
almost like what Ayn Rand would say, where the desires of rational men do not contradict one another. It sounds like.
I would say so, yeah.
Yeah, I would actually agree with that in many ways. Although, so it seems like you're doing the same thing as I would do. Is almost like it's okay because eudaimonia, egoism, virtue, and happiness are the same thing. You cannot have a good life without endeavoring to achieve what is a unified understanding of good. When you would try to achieve a singular understanding of good, I think someone like Ayn Rand would say, you're basically putting the cart before the horse. You already think you know what happiness is, and you're trying to achieve it before you've actually worked out what happiness means.
Exactly, and that's one of the biggest problems in meta-philosophy is when people actually neglect the very subject of meta-philosophy. They don't look towards how can we stipulatively apply ourselves in the general data set that philosophy studies. Of course, there are multiple methods that we actually do need to understand fully before we apply ourselves in the subjects of epistemology, ethics, and ontology. We need to understand how to do the phenomenological reduction, so that would probably satisfy a lot of the continentalists out there. And we also need to understand how to do conceptual analysis, as well as metaphysical dependence, or outlining or explicating metaphysical dependence. So yeah, stuff like that. Yeah, so we need to actually fully understand that.
You see, like, I'm just wondering, when you are faced with the point where if someone goes, okay, so in order to achieve happiness, I've got to do that which is desirable, and that which is desirable does not impact my preferences. How would you tell them that their preferences are actually not in line with happiness itself? Because where I usually go down the route is I usually argue that happiness is a judgment based upon the temporal lives of an individual. So you'd say that, well, we don't judge happiness on a single moment. We judge it across a span of time. And thus, humans enter the fourth dimension through language. We'd say that we understand our relation between events because the I can be transmuted across a period of time that we aren't actually experiencing in this moment, or simply through memory. So this would be, language as reason. And then when I would say that, then a lot of the time people will be with us with language as reason, actually, because a lot of the time they're like, you'll find a lot of people like to dismiss the value of animals based upon the fact that they would say, well, okay, so animals don't have reason, so they don't have selves. And I'd say, well, that's not exactly what I'm going to argue, but we'll get on to that in a minute. But most people agree until that point. And then we'll talk about epistemic justification. So I think what the argument that you're going through is that what I would like to say is, like, how do we move epistemically to what happiness is then? How would you say that happiness is not just a singular experiences that can be expressed through power? So why couldn't I just achieve let's say I even worked out that, okay, desire itself, like this permanent desiring, was in fact suffering in a Socratic way. So I was to say that, well, Socrates was actually right. To desire is to suffer. But what I could do is, if I get enough power, then I can have both the felicity necessary to sustain any desire that could pop up, but also be like Marcus Aurelius and be the emperor who is the Stoic. Yeah. So how would you respond to someone who just tries to achieve their own good rather than the good of a holistic view of individuals? And how would you tell them that you're not breaching the is-ought gap by evaluating something that is simply an is rather than an ought? Like, why would you say you should desire the desires of others?
Yeah, okay, so it's necessarily not about the contingent desires of others. It's not about desires plural. It's about the category itself, desire, and what exactly desire is, in fact, categorically about. So first and foremost, you can't reliably produce something that's prescriptive about desires by appealing to something that is contingent. You need something that is universal. You need something that is necessary, something that is categorical. You cannot say that your system has prescriptive power if it doesn't have stipulation or universality. So in the case of someone who says that they're just going to go through their preferences, sure, they can incidentally achieve the moral, but one, they cannot know that they are achieving it, and two, they cannot reliably achieve the moral. So that's absolutely a massive problem.
Aristotle would agree wholeheartedly. Like,
Yeah. So, what was the second point that you wanted me to respond to?
Essentially, but so the idea is that what you're relying upon there is epistemics. You're saying that, well, what we need is justification, and that it's categorical, and that desire itself is the category that we are placed in, and so we have to judge it. And it's a nice way, I think, of saying it. Actually, I think where we say that it's almost like what we're evaluating is desire itself, not an individual desire in a particular indication. It's I think Aristotle puts it, and typically virtue ethicists put it as the good life for me becomes the good life for man. And it's this idea that to evaluate what is in the best interest of me, I have to evaluate what is in the best interest of everyone, to gain any useful knowledge of in regards to myself. I have to evaluate what is knowable in regards to what I am and how I will be transposed through this temporal relation with time. So when I see myself transported into the future in 50 years, understanding the biology, for example, of someone who's 70-year-old, it will give me an insight into the life I want to live now, because I understand that smoking may one day catch up with me, for example, and things like that. So it does provide a useful indication, but I think more so you're going down the pure epistemics of it, where you're saying the actual justification itself cannot be singular. Now, yeah. I think there's something there. I think that's definitely an argument that's useful. I think I would love to see how my friend Dave would respond to that, because I think he's somewhere between a Kantian and a descriptivist. So I don't know how you'd feel about that. But
yeah, that'd be definitely interesting.
He's in a dichotomy, I think. Anyway, but I think the issue is that why would you say that? I suppose, like, I completely agree that happiness has to be something that we would achieve, right? And I would also agree that epistemic justification is not something that can be individuated. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to take consideration of animals, does it? Because I could gain epistemic justification without understanding animals, unless you're saying that there is, for some reason, like an animal's desires and my desires are the same category. And then what we can place into consideration is, why do we categorize desires in such a way? Why am I placing desire in a way that fundamentally encompasses all? So I could say that, well, actually, I shouldn't place it as desire. I should place it as the people who hold similar natures as me. So even the desires of those people in my language community who have relevant desires. And epistemically, I don't think there's any reason why that wouldn't function. Or would you disagree?
Okay. Give me a second. I need to really just kind of like make sure that I'm not going to goof up on this. Okay, so could you actually repeat? God damn it! Could you repeat just the crux of this?
If I'm understanding your argument properly, it's that there's a category that is desire, and that since philosophy dictates that which is categorical and prescriptive in the first place, that's how we understand what we should be doing. Why do we categorize desire as such an inclusive category in the first place? Why should I look at all desire in the same?
Yeah, so I'll first and foremost, I don't subscribe to the idea that that oughts are contained within the definition of desire. I don't think that at all. I think that it is action urging because it literally has a connection with our response systems, like our actual neurophysiology. So it does like definitively functionally urge us to act in specific ways. So that's one acquaintance, article of acquaintance knowledge of what desire is in and of itself is one that it does definitively urge us to action, because it doesn't mean the same type of thing as if it ceases to have action urgency. Belief, being the other propositional attitude state or category, doesn't have action urgency, but it does have action determination capacities. So those are stipulative, just stipulations garnered from acquaintance knowledge and knowledge by description, just simply of what is essential and indispensable when referring to these categories of mental states in the first place. It doesn't mean the same category of thing to dispense of those essential constituent conditionals. As soon as you dispense of them, you're talking about something completely separate. So, say for instance, if you want to dispense of desire being about well-being, but you still want to keep the categorical that it has action urgency on the agent, then you might be talking about some sort of subspecies of intention, as intention is a subspecies of desire, as desire is being referred to in this universalist type sense.
Right. So
yeah.
what you're saying is that, like, desire itself is the universal action urging capacity of all sentient beings, because that is what evaluation is. It's the ability to see something as good or bad and forces us to drive forwards. Either you run away from something or you run towards something.
Yeah, but let me also specify that it doesn't mean that we just simply comport ourselves to how we are feeling urgently, because that would be comporting yourself to a contingency which has zero prescriptive power. So you need to comport yourself to the category. So it's action urgency about a very specific type of thing. And as I said before, it's action urgency about well-being, as well-being is the total category of all possible positive necessary, incorrigible, positive valuations. And that can split into two categories. It can split into the hedonistic happiness conception of well-being, but it can also split into the perfectionist, flourishing conception of well-being. And in order to...
Sorry. I guess my first question is, one, why would you say that you couldn't be a descriptive egoist? Where you were saying, like, would you say that it is inherently prescriptive, that because of what, like, for example, I would argue that ethikos, and I'd go down the Aristotelian line, that it's actually understandings of how we should behave, and in regards to what is good or bad, and that good or bad is a metaphysical property of this evaluation, this natural judgment that we go down. Now, I guess there's a few questions I have, really. So when I was to say, like, if I was to say what is, like, if someone was to ask you, like, you know, Moore's open-ended question, I don't know if you've ever come across Moore's open-ended question. Probably, if you've done, have you come across anything like
that? No,
so,
not yeah.
Moore's open-ended question was something put forward in his principia. I can't say it. God damn it.
Principia.
Principia Ethica. Now, Principia. No, yeah. It's his beginning of the 20th century. Essentially, he argues that it was always open to interpretation. He's like, well, what is this object you're pointing to? What is good? And then people would be like, well, good is this and good is that. And you were always given a different definition of what good is. Now, I think that's encompassed in your idea of something that necessitates action, but you said that it doesn't include an ought, like that within that there is that there's no necessity to will, let's say, towards, let's say, pleasure or pain. Would you say at least there's an ought there that necessitates in subjectivity?
Okay, if you're going to be using ought in a subjective sense in the first place, which is literally equivalent to all possible positive valuations, then it becomes vacuous and literally just exhausts all instances of hedonistic and perfectionistic well-being.
Well, yeah, so, phenomenological positive and phenomenological negative. And I'm not going to lie, that is how I would look at. I would take it from that point. So I would say that, okay, though there's instances of good and bad phenomenologically, and if I dial back, I know that I cannot deny my desiring, and my desiring is either move towards something or away from something, and based upon that, it is an evaluative aspect of my existence. Now, you're saying it's action urging. Can an action be urged without an evaluation? Would you say that? Or
No, because I don't think desires are inherently evaluations. I think they are relatively autonomous, actually. And I don't think that desires are necessarily to actual like direct thought of propositions. It is a propositional attitude state, but that's attitudes about a category of things, not necessarily an attitude state about explicitly represented propositions.
okay, so if you just to go through that again, so you would say that a desire doesn't necessarily have to be good or bad, but it does have to move forward, and that's what I'm trying to point out.
It does necessarily have to urge our action in order for it to be a desire in the first place.
I agree. Yeah. Okay. Now, is that an evaluation or not?
No. Okay. Well, actually, it depends on how you're using the word evaluation. I don't know how you're using it and what exactly you're asking of me.
Just phenomenologically good or bad. Does it invoke an experience of good or bad within an individual that would
an experience? Okay, so does it invoke a positive or negative experience phenomenologically? Yes, absolutely. But if you want to create a framework of that is just simply explicative of our phenomenological experience, you're literally delving into a species of descriptive psychology. That's no longer philosophy. That is no longer morality. That's no longer ethics, because it has zero prescriptive power. If you want to bait, and that's once again the point I'm going to hit home, is that you cannot get stipulative or prescriptive powers from simply pointing to contingencies. They have to be categoricals. They have to be necessary. They have to be universal. They have to be second order. They have to relate between first order properties. They have to be necessary connections. They can't just simply be basic first order inessential contingencies that may or may not exist type thing. That's basically the point I want to hit home.
Yeah, so I guess it's not an argument I've ever really heard before, if I'm honest. I haven't heard anyone make these kind of arguments. I mean, maybe it's because I do Continental, and we're just too human. We're far too human for this kind of this terminology. The idea of divorcing ourselves from well, it feels like, for example, if I was to ask you why should I do what is good, then you would say like what is good is happiness. I'm assuming. Is that right? Well, flourishing.
Oh, I'm a perfectionist, so I would say what is good is that which reliably produces flourishing. So
what is flourishing?
Okay, so flourishing is so I've actually written down the definition so I don't screw this up. So ultimately, because it is a perfectionist conception, which is also a eudaimonic conception, is that it is excelling at things that are worth doing. And in order to determine what is worth doing, you need to actually understand the correspondent theory of ethics, the correspondent theory of well-being. Pardon me. And the correspondent theory of well-being has to carry the ontological commitment of being objective in the sense that we're referring to, which is objective about second-order properties, which is I might as well give you a couple examples of what can be second-order properties.
What well-being is for you?
Sorry?
What is well-being?
Okay, so well-being. So I actually hold to it's pretty obvious. I hold to the objectivist conception of well-being, which is that some of the things that are good for an individual are good for them independently of their attitudes about them. So it's independent of contingent values. Like, say, for instance, regardless if you want to or not, doing something that, say, for instance, increases the net well-being reasonably, within reason, within, of course, moral criterion reason, you ought to do it regardless. So that's ultimately like the idea of well-being. And the reason that it has that type of power is because that kind of well-being has actually a stipulative connection to the propositional attitude state of desires. And it necessarily reliably produces the product or the content of desires, other than, of course, the particularist or systems universalist approach to ethics. It does actually reliably produce that which is the content of desires, unlike the unlike those alternative conceptions. And that's ultimately why I hold to the objectivist conception of well-being, is because it does actually, like as I said before to you, if we hold to the perfectionist account, the objective perfectionist account of well-being, it actually incidentally reliably produces also the hedonistic case of well-being, which is of course just happiness and stuff like that. It incidentally, on the whole, on the net, it produces it reliably.
I can understand that. So I mean, but then what we're saying really is that we do it because we're driven to it. Would you agree, or would you say that it's something that is just logically necessitated?
It's logically necessitated because it has an essential connection to something that does drive action.
Right.
That's why the ought exists.
You see, that's what I would say. So I would say well-being. You're saying well-being is related to evaluations and objective evaluations of individuals based upon categories. If I'm understanding it.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. That's very Kantian. And I don't have that much of a problem with Kant at times.
Yeah.
But ultimately, if I was to ask you, I think if I was to ask you what you should do, you would have to tell me within reference to those drives in the first place, yeah? Like, because if you didn't, then it would be vacuous, right? Like, because you would be in the Kantian do duty for duty's sake. Would you say to do your duty for duty's sake, or?
Okay, so that depends on the conception of duty, of course. Like if you're like, I'm not a deontologist. I only hold to certain deontic principles. Possibly, I don't even know if I do yet. It actually is a necessary extension from the superordinate categorical principle that utilitarianism puts forward. So,
Kant said that the being, or was it the rational end of all beings is happiness. And it seems like if you're saying happiness is flourishing.
I would say, okay, so like as I said before, there are two conceptions of well-being, and the one that you're referring to when you say happiness, that's the hedonistic conception. I'm following the perfectionist conception.
I mean, it depends on what you understand happiness to be, because I mean, happiness could be like happiness is just it seems to be fairly vacuous. I couldn't tell you exactly like what the happy life is. I couldn't, and I think that's the Aristotelian point. So if we just say it's a telos, we'll just say that the telos of all beings is to achieve the good, since what desired forces were forward. What I'm struggling to bridge right now, the necessity of going forward, because and I'd like to point out we agree on a lot, because I'm a moral realist, I'm a vegan, you're a moral realist, you're a vegan, and it's great to have someone that clearly has done a lot of reading on here. But obviously, like reading is very different than what I'm used to, for one, and the terminology I'm not used to. But I think I understand what you're putting forward for the most part.
Excellent.
But I do struggle to see how we're going from how we're getting this logical necessity just because it's predictive. But why are we making predictions in the first place?
I wouldn't say predictive, I would say stipulative. There's a very important distinction between stipulative.
Okay, yeah. You said, okay, so stipulative would be the categories, but then it's predictive upon those categories, like you said, right?
Yeah, but that'd be incidental, and I would say that'd be categorically erroneous to start talking about predictions in a subject that's fundamentally philosophical. Predictions are only to scientific evaluation, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I mean, you've got people like Hegel who argue that that it's the science of right.
Oh God, Hegel. No, no. Actually, my metaphysical philosophical view has philosophy, one, as being the residue of the sciences, two, being contiguous with the sciences, and three, being foundational about something that is
science.
Sorry?
Did you call philosophy the residue of science there?
Whew. Yeah.
It's like it's like you've attacked me so.
No, but when I say residue, or say, for instance, midwife, All I'm saying is that it actually provides with the very necessary glue that actually keeps science together in the first place. And not only that,
do without the nurses, right?
Sorry?
I said, what would the doctors do without the nurses, right?
Yeah.
No, I understand what you're saying. I disagree. I would say, like, I mean, where it come from was quite a scientific deductive method. I mean, like sophism, from what I'm aware, which kind of actually predated philosophy, and its tradition a lot of it came from Greek scientific thought of like how to well, deductive thought.
Scientific,
Sophism uses the same method as the Socratic method, if anyone's interested. It just has different aims. So
they try to force you into contradiction.
Just to win the argument. Now, Socrates tries to form the idea of a contradiction to try and understand truth, and that's the difference.
Exactly.
The conversation ends in one situation, the conversation begins in another. So we'll just move briefly on from calling philosophy science's midwife, and we'll skate over that.
Sure. Yeah, go
ahead. Right. Okay, but the issue I've got here is we definitely, you would agree that we cannot divorce those urging forward drives that desire is, right? From why we endeavor to understand in the first place. Like, why do we conceptualize philosophy in such a way that we grasp at knowledge? Why do we want knowledge? Why do we care?
Okay, so this can actually delve into a discussion of intrinsic value. And I would say that the valuation of truth in of itself is intrinsic. And despite what people may think, it actually doesn't have conflicts with, say, for instance, a fundamental valuation of, say, well-being. Like, I'll give you an example of the typical case that's actually brought up. If you were to tell people the truth and it diminished their well-being, would you still be valuing well-being by telling them the truth, or would you still be valuing truth if you were to just comport to their well-being? Now, the thing about it is you're actually comporting to the truth of well-being. And another thing to take into consideration, so you're comporting the truth of their well-being and what produces well-being if you comport to what produces well-being. Pretty simple stuff, right? But another thing is that you're not obliged to be open and honest simply by valuing the truth. You can still value the truth and not tell them the truth that would diminish their well-being. You can still believe that it's true.
You actually feel like you're Immanuel Kant reborn. You were about to tell me that I don't have to tell people the truth, but I just don't have to say anything. I have to tell the truth, but I just don't have to say it. Okay.
Yeah, I personally have not actually read any of Kant's work, especially in depth. But it's very interesting how you're calling me Kantian. Like for the most part, I'm not the biggest fan of him.
You probably disagree on some fundamental points. For example, the idea of being teleological, like that's a big thing. Like he's deontological. He's tell you to abide by certain laws and principles, but it feels like aim to do a thing in regards to a telos, but the telos is logically necessitated by what categorization in the first place.
If Kant is like purely deontological, I can't say that he's actually following anything that has prescriptive power. He's just following something that is fundamentally, like, say, for instance, where we have the split, the actual dichotomy between teleological theories and deontological theories. The big difference is teleological theories derive what is right from what is good. And then
where you derive what is good in the first place.
We'll get to that in a second. I just want to quickly say deontology in of itself is separate from teleological theories in that deontology derives what is right from what is jurisprudential. So, like, an example of this would be, say, for instance, what is the law of the land, or what is it's fundamentally it runs into massive problems of arbitrary prescriptive power.
It's a priori. So the idea is that it fundamentally will come down to the point where we will understand what should be done because of something that is, and rather than something that ought to be achieved. And that's how Kant runs in, I think, to the is-ought problem in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
But
so I wouldn't agree with him on
I'm
that.
worried that's where I'm not going to lie to you. I'm worried that's where we're going here.
Yeah, I don't want to
just wondering-
fallaciously bridge the is-ought gap. No.
So, would you say that you couldn't tell someone that they should evaluate something? Or?
I would say that they okay, so out of the okay, so there are two approaches to it. There's the approach that says, okay, so if you're going to value truth, or if you do value truth, then you ought to evaluate, or I guess reevaluate certain types of things. Sure, but that requires certain conditional approaches to actually explain why exactly they should evaluate. An example of this could be like contrastivism, so where you're basically pointing out the different conditions that underpin and hold up their arguments in the first place, and whether or not they actually do they contain a complete sequitur instead of like running into a non sequitur or something like that. Yeah, sure. So, stuff like that. That's like, I'd say it's contextualist. But then we also have like the other approach, which is to say that truth in and of itself is an indispensable intrinsic value that you can't dispense of, because in order for you to fulfill anything that you ought to do in the first place, it needs to be true about reality. Reality is the only absolute we can rely on. We need a conception, and this actually could take us into the final of reality operating.
We both metaphysically that logic is necessitated, and in that case, epistemics are necessitated, because we'll go down the point in which we'll go, well, actually, the reason that you wanted logic in the first place is to make arguments, and you just so happen to be forced into making arguments, because you.
Okay, so this can actually take us down to the discourse of, okay, why exactly ought we make, not why ought, or why do we need to make coherent arguments in order for our arguments to be sound and valid and stuff like that. I guess that actually that's circular. That sounds circular. I'll probably know that some other time.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
I think the reason I'm a bit is I'm asking you why I should try and predict the future, or like, yeah, so I can.
Yeah, sorry. I completely misspoke. To say that you were to reliably produce your own desires, that to me sounds completely absurd. To reliably produce the essential components of desires, of desire. Oh my god.
Yeah. So that's Ayn Rand. Okay, we're there. I'm cool with that. Ayn Rand is great. You can agree that you egoistically are forced into an evaluative process which pushes you into predictive behaviors, where you'd go, I want to achieve X. To achieve X, I need to perform. Was it A, B, C? And that's because humans are temporal through language, and then language forces us to accept certain epistemic requirements. Okay, now I would agree right through to this point, but why is it? Okay, like could I postulate a scenario to you that, because it seems like what you're saying is that it's a perfectionist view, and that by achieving, it's almost like the kingdom of ends, and that by achieving the happiness of everyone to the greatest degree, I will achieve that happiness for me to the greatest degree. And then something that almost Hegel would say, where he says the I finds itself the subjective finds itself in the objective. It is within that categorization in the first place.
Yeah,
it's within the judgments. Now, here's the thing. So if I was to say, what makes one decision better than another, what would you say to me?
What makes one decision better than another is dependent on whether or not it reliably produces well-being, or it is adherent to what reliably produces well-being. It coheres to it, it comports to it. So,
and well-being is
sorry, go ahead.
And well-being is the expression of um of flourishing, which you say it's flourishing itself, and flourishing can be something that is separate from what we feel to be good or bad. Is that always the case? Can something be good even though it produces something we wouldn't feel to be good or bad? Because it seems like by
Yeah,
well-being, we are saying that, for example, I could produce a scenario in which more people suffer.
sure. Okay, so the whole thing about it is, yeah. Oh, yeah. Go ahead if you're going to make a point. Sure.
So if you say like, if more people will suffer, but happiness is necessitates one way of thinking. Usually, let's say like for us to make predictive predictions upon these categorizations that we've made, these stipulations.
Yeah,
So epistemically, I would be without justification to act in a way that wouldn't be in this universalized way.
sure.
But when I act in this way, I would be causing more suffering. I could cause more suffering. Would you say that I should still act in that way?
Okay, so then we can also have, okay, now we have to also define and separate the two different categories of suffering, because as there are two different categories of well-being, there of course are two antithetical definitions or stipulations of what isn't well-being. So in the case of what is opposed to well-being is suffering. So suffering in the hedonistic sense, of course, would just be simply like the feeling of sadness or a feeling of misery, or perhaps angry emotions, all these kinds of particular contingent things, not necessarily based on something that is morally obliged or something that necessarily produces good. You could be experiencing negative valuation, although very, very likely not like extremely detrimental in the case of someone like acting in utilitarianism's favor. Like, I'll give you an example. Say, for instance, if we were to implement laws regarding veganism and diet, like, of course, that would cause some people to suffer in that very hedonistic sense. But then again, it has that type of suffering has no prescriptive power for the same reason that hedonism in general has no prescriptive power, and that happiness and contingent mental content has no prescriptive power. So if it has no prescriptive or stipulative power, there's absolutely zero reason to consider it within our purview of philosophical discourse, because philosophical discourse is necessarily stipulative and prescriptive. Yeah. So
I mean,
um,
I'm not gonna
go
lie.
ahead.
The only issue that I'm finding here is that we could be denying those essential characteristics which first moved us to philosophy in originally. So we would
Sure.
be denying, I mean, as Albert Camus might say, man is by nature, man is the only animal that can deny its own nature.
Mm,
Which is cool. I can understand why you'd say that. I mean, he's an existentialist and nihilist, I think, pretty much like so. Well, somewhere between that. Was it life without meaning can still be fun, but literally like the absolute opposite of what you're arguing from. But
mm,
it seems like what would be saying there is that those moral duties are actually based upon those desires that move you forward in the first place. But then
yeah.
from that point, we begin to, after we accept logic and epistemic justification, comes this intrinsic value of truth finding, and
Yeah.
that supersedes our evaluation of good in the first place, of like our hedonistic conception of good.
Right.
Is that what you're arguing?
Um,
Because it feels
yeah.
it very
Sorry.
well might be saying that good is one thing, then good is another, and that they're actually just equivocated definitions of good.
Yeah. So, and that's exactly what I think is why it's important to make sure that when you're actually discussing morality with someone, you make a concerted effort to separate their arguments as being contingent from being universal, because that determines the very difference between descriptive psychology
I
and
don't think there's an
morality.
element that's absolutely non-contingent, because otherwise, what would your judgment portray, right? Like the whole point is okay, we're talking about beings that desire. well, what are those beings? What do they
Okay,
desire?
yeah,
What is flourishing for these beings in the first place? Unless
sure.
you know it, I don't think that you could say that you could achieve anything in regards to
Ah,
well-being.
so yeah, this is a necessary stipulation in and of itself. I would have to say that when I'm talking about contingencies, it's contingencies of universal categories. So desires, so things that fall within the category of desires, they're subordinate. So I probably have to use the subordinate superordinate as a split or distinction. So as soon as you're talking about like anything that is in fact like simply a description of your present mental content. So that could be like, I believe that that it is raining outside. That is a case of contingent mental content that falls within the purview of the category of beliefs. It's a contingent belief. So in the case of desires, as soon as someone starts to talk about contingent desires, they're not talking about philosophy anymore. They're at least not necessarily. They could be talking about phenomenology. Phenomenology, I do accept, is a philosophy, albeit an empirical philosophy. But as soon as they start talking about descriptive psychology, in the sense that we're talking about our desires and what we believe sociologically is normally good, and what we typically believe to have prescriptive powers when they in fact don't, then we're talking about descriptive psychology. It's experimental philosophy about morality. It's not morality itself. It is more akin to simply a sociology of philosophical perspectives. So it's, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I agree. I think in many ways, I think I think what you're arguing, if I've got it right, is that the idea that we 1 second.
Sure, take all the time you need.
Sorry about that. So I guess
Okay.
what I would say, that from what I understand, this is what you're arguing: the idea that, okay, so within the category of desire is desires. Uh, those desires tell us, like, that, for example, if we contingently use them to formulate what I would call a good and not the good, we will only achieve a good, and it will have an appearance of the good. We will maybe feel some pleasure, or we'll feel some gratification, but
I
we
would
will,
say that's a simple description of a hedonistic
yeah,
perceived good. You say that
yeah,
as a stipulative or prescriptive. Yeah, exactly.
yeah. Now, my only worry is that when you say desire, but you don't point towards these desires, and this is why I think Hegel says that he talks about, like, let's say, if I say it, respect. Okay, so let's say you say we should achieve well-being, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you were to take like a Kantian and he was to say, you should show other individuals respect, you'd say, how do I do that? What is respect?
Yeah. So, okay. So then we're talking about virtue ethics. Now, I think virtue ethics can only be determined after you firstly establish a superordinate categorical, I guess, law. And that would be, say, for instance, that utilitarianism's principle of utility, as long as it's properly and objectively conceived. So it has prescriptive and stipulative power. And
Yeah,
then after
I
that,
think
yeah,
we're very similar points. I think I take a different way of arguing it. I think I do argue from the same point as you, that I go through Ayn Rand pretty much. Go through, except then I would say that how we understand these things comes very much into consideration of, like, why we're trying to achieve them. I think we'll both agree on the end goal and how we get to this conception of the end goal and the empirical verifications of it. And you tend to talk about philosophy as being stipulative and categorical,
yes, yeah,
and prescriptive. Sorry,
yeah.
I think I think a lot of the time I just assume that. I think a lot of the time I tell people, I assume that people, when they're arguing, that they're trying to achieve something. Otherwise,
Yeah.
why aren't you lying on the floor dying right now?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. So
I would take almost the Ayn Rand approach, where she would say that that the fact that you are choosing, that there is a volition to think,
mhm.
only asserts that you are desiring in the first place.
Yeah.
And I would say that to deny that you desire would be a lie. I would just call into question. I mean, there is you are not a subject anymore.
Yeah, because the simple act of making the proposition that you do not believe in and of itself is a belief. So it's a propositional attitude state about the reality of your own mental states, whether or not they do in fact exist or not. That is necessarily a belief. So and that's why nihilists literally cannot sustain their account of lacking belief completely, because that in of itself commits them to there being a category of propositional attitude states that is about the reality of their own mental content. That is literally what defines stipulatively belief in and of itself.
Okay, so metaethically, we're at objectivism.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I need you to show me how I get from egoism to altruism, and I also need to, which I think you've done quite well. I think you've done that really. I think you've argued that the idea of the egoism is contained within altruism, almost, based upon the way in which we formulate arguments in the first place. It is necessitated by the way in which epistemic justification can be given based on the categories in which we understand desire, because otherwise it would be contingent in which we've argued. Now, what I'm saying, though, is that judgments are inherently contingent always, yeah? So this is where you were saying you're going to get onto virtue ethics. Now, I very much appreciate that you're going to go on to virtue ethics, because I think that's where the argument needs to go. I think if you're going to argue anything, in fact, I'd argue anything. Just argue virtue ethics. I don't know why anyone goes purely consequentialist. I think to divorce the two seems a bit. It just seems a bit foreign to me, to be honest. It just seems a bit unnecessary to divorce.
In all honesty, like technically I am a pure consequentialist, but I can still hold deontic-like principles that follow out of extension from the basic rule, and that also have entailments about moral character, which is virtue ethics.
Yeah,
they can be.
That's essentially Hegelian moral philosophy. Then we're going to get into it. Because in value theory, well, actually, you know what? We'll let you go through your bit, and then I'll explain Hegel.
Oh God, yeah, that's gonna, yeah, sure, yeah. So,
if you explain why I would try to achieve one good over another, so how would I come to the conclusion that I should do one action over another action to achieve well-being?
Okay, so all I can do is so as it stands, like I've prepared for this kind of question, but all I can provide you with is the type of metaphysical methodology that is required for pointing out stipulations and for pointing out prescriptions. So what actually does prescribe you? So how exactly can you go about determining an ought in the first place? And it's literally simply one, you need to understand the imperative of coherence, primarily because in order for you to be necessarily representing the category ought, you need to have something that is logically equivalent to the ontological commitment of ought. So what does ought mean? What does it entail? So it is a second order property. So in order to understand what exactly drives ought in the first place, you need to understand that it is only something that emerges out of a necessary connection between the essential constituent parts of a propositional attitude state. In the case of ought, it's a propositional attitude state that has action urgency appended to it, essentially, and what action urgency is necessarily about. So in the case of desires, action urgency is about necessary positive valuation, which includes hedonistic and perfectionistic conceptions of well-being.
Okay, but the issue, how should I act?
How should you act? That's okay. So this is applied philosophy. This is absolutely applied philosophy.
It's normative.
Okay, how should you act? Okay, so they're pretty simple. If we're talking about normatives, we're talking about principles. So you should act in comportment to well-being. Simple.
Okay, and well-being is the flourishing of all beings.
Okay, yeah. Well-being, properly philosophically conceived, is the flourishing case. Yeah, sure.
Okay, and what does that look like?
And what does it look like? Okay, now we're delving into applied philosophy. I don't. Yeah.
I would say that unless you can tell me one action over another, then it's vacuous. Mm-hmm. Then I would say, like, well, I don't. You've told me that I should do the good, but there seems to be nothing there. What
Okay,
is?
so an example that contains the property of well-being, like the property of flourishing. So is that what you're asking? You're
Yeah,
asking for
just
a
like, for
passion that.
example, why should I be vegan over being a meat eater?
Okay, simple.
What about the normative and applied philosophy necessitates logically from those? I mean, the meta should lead through.
Yep.
This is, I mean, like obviously, like as someone who does ethics, I don't typically stay in meta normative.
Yep, and that's good.
I take it through. So
Exactly,
I
that's the
want
best
to
way to do
know
it.
why I should be vegan.
Because veganism, it literally does entail the principal movement towards more well-being on the whole. If you do value well-being, and you do, out of literal definitional necessity, if you are in fact a sentient agent, you have desires. If you have desires, you necessarily value well-being. Now, that could be the hedonistic or perfectionistic conception, doesn't matter. The perfectionistic conception doesn't necessarily contain all positive valuations, but it does in fact contain the positive valuations that necessarily produce what is good in the moral sense. So if you're going to value well-being, and you do, necessarily, in order to do what you ought, which is to, of course, to comport yourself to what well-being is and how to reproduce it, then needlessly contributing to an animal holocaust, of course, is inessential and is highly contradictory to your very valuation of well-being. If you value well-being and you understand that these animals are sentient, then it literally goes against your own values to continue to value the action urgency towards getting animal products in the first place. It is a fundamental prescriptive or stipulative contradiction. It cannot be sustained. You cannot value the thing that you cannot help but value, and also value its negation for a simple hedonistic pleasure.
Right. Just trying to make sure I've got everything right, like, because I don't want to, obviously, I don't want to like straw man you here and take it.
Exactly.
I mean, like, obviously, I just want to give you adequate critique if I can.
Sure.
I'm sure Shadow is probably like one of my friends. He's a moral descriptivist. He's probably sat screaming in the comments right now.
Good.
But I'm just trying to think about why. Okay, so we would perform well-being in this case because we cannot help but desire, and we try to achieve well-being itself because we cannot help but desire well-being, because well-being includes our own well-being, right? Because it's categorical.
Yeah, well-being is contained within a propositional attitude state. It is a constituent part of attitude state desire. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And well-being is necessitated by those beings that desire. See, this is similar to an argument I would make usually about moral consideration. It just doesn't know how I should consider them. So if someone says, phenomenologically, an animal does not have an experience past the point in which you kill it. If I was to knock it unconscious and murder it, have I decreased well-being as a whole?
Yes, you have, because you've literally limited their ability to experience well-being in the first place by cutting their life short. That in of itself is a negative valuation of well-being. That's a contradiction to your fundamental criterion of valuation.
Okay, I'd agree. I would normally make a very similar argument, but then I'd point towards judgment itself, and that's what we've got to do. We've got to say that actually it's about judgment, not just about the animal's experience, because we say, well, no, the animal didn't experience harm. But you say, well, the animal didn't experience the harm, but the difference is an evaluation between two possible judgments, which is what we're doing in the first place. We're evaluating whether we should take action A or action B. And in this case, action A produces more well-being than action B, so we should
Okay, so I got to stop you right there. That would be a methodology that I do not hold to at all. That would be something that only falls within the purview of I think, descriptive decision theory. I hold to normative decision theory in that we are trying to determine from scratch, or at least not from scratch. When I would say scratch, it'd be in reference to our stipulative and prescriptive philosophical law and principle. That it's not to simply choose the better option of two. It's literally to determine what is necessarily moral from the situation, given all of the conditions that we are aware of. It's not simply to determine whether or not, if we're to choose from a random selection of decision A versus decision B, like that in of itself strikes me as non-philosophical, non-stipulative, non-prescriptive. It doesn't seem like it'd be adequate to facilitate morality reliably.
Really? So would you say that there can only ever be one course of action?
It'd be, in what sense?
So it's almost like, because I mean, the way we look at it, these are the behaviors. I mean, you were about to go down virtue ethics. Actually, let's take you down. Let's go down virtue ethics.
Sure.
Like I'm just saying. No, I was saying like go for it. Give me why I should be a virtue ethicist.
Like, I'm not a virtue ethicist, but like I
thought you said that.
No, I think there's a possibility of there being some logical extensions from, say, okay, so this is how I structure my normative ethics. My normative ethics includes all three in certain very closed off senses. So if we have a superordinate categorical principle, which is the absolute foundation of our entire normative moral framework, say, for instance, that could be utilitarianism and a properly conceived philosophical conception of the utility principle, what could follow would be rule utilitarianism, which can be conceived as a type of a deontic type set of rules and parameters. And from these deontic type sets of rules and parameters that logically extend from the utility principle, we can also ascribe certain types of character types that reliably do cohere logically to these deontic type extensional rules. I don't see that as being a problem. I think that is possible. Like, I couldn't give you an example.
That sounds like Hegelian moral philosophy. For example, we would understand he would argue it would be the limits of reason itself when we're making judgments. So, for example, if I was to say one action was better than another in the first place, what I'm doing is I'm conforming the actions to rational judgment. And when I'm using what he say is, for example, the interpretation of a law is based upon reason in the first place, was the crime committed and so on. But he would go before that. He'd say, like, for example, if we take why we do the laws in the first place, to be Aristotle, it'd be like, okay, so we'll have these laws because of a prime value. That prime value comes from this desiring, and then we'll go down that line, and we end up saying that, okay, if I value myself, then I may be required to value others. Now, this is the point in which we'll get onto in a second, because I think we need to go back there. I do think.
Sure.
But I also would like to say that in Hegelian philosophy, let's say we do manage to get onto altruistic philosophy, then he would say that why should we commit one good over another? And he would say it will be the dictates of reason. But how do we do it? Well, we would create a deontological set of rule evaluations, and then by adhering to said rules, the interpretation of the laws is what gives us the new overarching understanding of well-being, for example, what well-being actually means within because the limits of our knowledge have increased. The limits of our knowledge have increased, well, moral dictates have increased. The moral dictates have increased, then the rules change. So the rules, the deontological structures that govern our behaviors, we interpret them, we act on them. By acting upon them, we change the institutions which facilitate them in the first place, which ultimately change the rules. And this is the dialectical method, isn't it? Thesis, thesis, synthesis, and Hegelian. It's a Hegel two-step. It's how it works. Now that's something I would take as being the case.
For sure. But it sounds more towards political philosophy than it is towards ethics.
Well, the philosophy of right is political and ethical. I don't think you can divorce them. I think that's Aristotle.
No,
Really.
for sure. But it depends what sense you're talking about. Like what exactly you're talking about when you're talking about what strikes me as being is
which
like
govern
ontological.
Sorry.
Sorry.
I'm just talking
No,
about
go ahead.
behavior in the first place. I mean, without going on to the way that our state is formed, I would say that what is man without the state? What are we? The I itself is not something that exists, that pre-exists the language which you are given. So I would say that to talk about ethics without politics is at least politics in the Aristotelian sense, not politics as in the current sense. Which is
sure. Yeah. I totally agree with that. What I was referring to was actually the usage of deontology. How do you separate deontology from any sort of rule teleological theory?
Well, this is the thing. It's not that he's a. Oh, do you mean like were you pulling into what I was saying, or were you trying to say like how would I separate deontology itself?
How would you separate deontology from rule teleological theories?
Yeah, not in reference to Hegel and what I just said, because he's not a deontologist.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, essentially.
Well, it's about consideration of, it's about intention alone rather than the teleos in the first place. It's the idea that this is what I was kind of worried with you, because I'm saying we should do good, and then you tell me, yeah, we should. Don't know what it is.
You don't know what good means, though. Okay, so yeah. Wait, still.
Yeah, it's almost it's like the fundamentals of a system.
Oh, I see. I think I've realized the inadequacy of my explication of my own position. Okay, so when I refer to good, of course, like we're going to start really talking about like normative and applied. I totally understand. Yeah, I totally get you now. So when I'm talking about what is good, I'm talking about that which, in the situation that you're given, and as being someone who is a prospective consequentialist, I believe that we have to act in our own epistemic limitations of being able to assess what is morally relevant, and acting thusly upon it to produce that which the outcome of which produces the most well-being reliably. So it could mean that like this is a possibility. It could mean that you actually produce temporarily a situation that has less well-being, but on the long haul, because it is based on moral law, necessarily continues to approximate and build up well-being over time. Whereas, like, and that could be separate from another action that could just immediately produce the most well-being. Like,
that makes sense. It's why we would be moved in the first place, because we're trying to maximize. We cannot help but desire that which is most desirable.
Yeah, and an example of this in practice. So now we're starting to delve into applied ethics. Say the economic situation of the meat industry, the dairy industry. Obviously, we can't just simply cut this stuff cold turkey. It needs to be a gradual progression away from it. And of course, because otherwise, a lot of resources get wasted from the simple, like the actual, the feeding of these animals in the first place. So there's a lot of energy output lost. And additionally to that, over time, like we'll have less land available due to the fact that these animals will still be grazing on these lots for absolutely zero economic, with zero economic potential or purpose, which is in fact a massive economic drain on society. And that in and of itself would be sufficient and necessary to cause businesses to reject the idea of moving in the direction of veganism, like or continuing to move in the direction of veganism and keeping people cut cold turkey from animal products. So there are supply and demand type principles that apply to these situations that don't allow us to maintain or sustain an ethical position while simply quitting stuff cold turkey. So of course, the whole cut cold turkey thing has a massive immediate moral implication, but over time, economically, and the entailments of its economic entailments, have a massive parasitic drain on morality. So I would say that would be a case where, in practice, It's not always necessarily that which immediately produces the most well-being descriptively. Because once again, if we're talking about simple descriptions, then we're outside of the purview of prescription and stipulation. So, and of course, that doesn't allow us to reliably produce well-being. We cannot reliably reproduce certain things unless we work from stipulation and prescription. It has to be universalized, because otherwise we have nothing to rely on that we can say will definitively reproduce. There has to be something that we're attempting to reproduce.
Yeah, I would say, like, it's like Hegel would say that it has to comport to reason. Same with Aristotle. Like, and reason, it's the dictates of reason.
Yeah.
For us to, and it's why we end.
Sorry,
it's why we ended in the first place. But the dictates of reason and why we ended in the first place was to achieve a goal. And that goal was our desires. Tell me again, just explain to me why I couldn't see people as a means to an end to achieve my own happiness. So Ayn Rand would say mainly because you need them epistemically, and I think that's the way you go down it, that there's an epistemic need. But why does that necessarily entail that I have to desire the happiness of everyone, and I can't just desire the happiness of those of within my particular group, even that require epistemic verification from? Because I mean, arguably, I don't even need to talk to other people. Not only that, I mean, like, let's say, look at it like this. Sometimes I can't. Like, there's other languages. The animals, for example, they don't help me out to achieve my happiness. Why the hell am I considering them in this categorization? And why don't I make I know that you say it's contingent. I think you would say that this is a contingent categorization. Why can't I make a contingent categorization? Because it includes myself. And the predictive powers upon that would certainly help me achieve at least my own, whether it's hedonistic or not would probably be the case. I would say it's maybe even hedonistic happiness.
Okay, so I have a double-edged sword for this. Okay, the first side of the sword is basically to say that you aren't actually consistently valuing the actual fundamental stipulative condition that is constitutive of desire.
I am valuing myself.
Yes, you are holding yourself to consistency of your own contingent case of well-being, but well-being isn't just existent or in more
the well-being I am necessitated to care about is.
Okay, that's incorrect, because well-being, actually the same category of well-being, and you are actually valuing the category of well-being, is also included in other subjects. So it is to break consistency to cease valuing well-being, just stopping off your valuation of well-being in yourself. It's not the location that the well-being is existent in. So you are a perspectival location. Now, well-being, of course, urges your action. It also urges everyone else's action. But that in of itself, I think that's vacuous. I think what is important to take into consideration is the fact that because you are literally out of pure necessity, valuing or descriptive necessity, or logical necessity, or metaphysical necessity, whatever we want to put it, you are necessarily valuing a category of things. So if this category of things also is located in other individuals, you have a reason to value them as well, because they also have that thing that you are valuing. If you just simply arbitrarily choose to value it in this location, you fall into the exact same position. You fall into the exact same problems as systematist universalists and particularists, which are just ultimately two different subspecies of each other. So, the problem is that any foundationally arbitrarily justified system or framework is thusly equally, even if equally contradictory, they're also thusly equally representative of this distinct category. So you cannot hold to it meta-ethically without biting the bullet on the principle of explosion, and it entailing that all of these equally contradictory frameworks and systems qualify as the category of second-order properties, morality. You have to bite the bullet on that.
Levinas. It's we resist each other with equal weight. because what I think of as good and what you think of as good inherently contradict one another. So the epistemic
Yeah.
verification of that
I
is
haven't. Yeah, I didn't give you the other side of the sword. The other side of the sword is a little bit weaker, but it's a statement of the nature of humanity and of the derivation of other types of values and peripheral categories of extrinsic values, like say for instance social and capital. So if in fact you do value impartially, which is the only logically necessitated movement or position to hold, then there is going to be some incidental carryover to social values. People will want to actually value you back because you yourself are demonstrating yourself as a reliable vector of producing that which is desirable. If people see you as a reliable vector of producing that which is desirable, they're going to desire you. They're going to desire you in certain senses.
extrinsically, like you are.
Exactly. Yeah. So that in of itself plays massive roles in you receiving yourself help from individuals, whether that be socially or capitally. So that's the other end of the sword of impartiality. Although I understand it's totally not as like deductively sound. It is 100% inductive. 100%.
Well, there's nothing necessarily wrong with what you've put forward there.
Yeah.
I think it's somewhat
I don't
similar
think philosophy
to.
should be done inductively. That's the problem.
Yeah, but I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't think there's anything. I would say that those desires in which you have, I think it's because really what we're talking about is a language game, and the rules of the game are inducted. That's just the way life works.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so this takes us into the territory of the problem of skepticism, my dude. So,
But like, I mean, like for example, like what I would say is that you enter the game in one instance, and you'll come out in a different instance, a different person. Well, one, you'll gain your personhood from language, but also I would say that you gain those values that you seek in the first place, those hedonistic ones, even from language. Now, I don't comport to a non-hedonistic view of human flourishing. I do just take it as it's instantations of pleasure throughout an individual's life across the what we could say is this categorization that you put forward. So we'd say that desire itself, those instantations of desire being fulfilled. Of course, desiring seems to be suffering, and I like to go down like a point of like how we should live and at Buddhism and how we should try and limit like some desires and express others, and talk about like how we should actually do anything. The only issue I'm having, I think, really with it, because I mean I think I agree with you for the most part. Like epistemically, I think we agree that epistemic justification requires individuals to interact with each other. The categorization bit, I'm unsure as to whether you could not create, for example, I care about the good of Germans. Why couldn't I do that and achieve German flourishing? Right.
I don't see myself as subscribing to.
You wouldn't subscribe to that. I'm saying, like, why couldn't an individual do that though? Why couldn't they say that?
I don't know. I'm not sure how that even deflates any of my positions. I'm not sure.
Well, because the idea is that they wouldn't be looking at desire itself and what is desirable. They'd be looking at their desires, how to achieve their desires. So they enter a language community of how to achieve their desires.
Okay, so that's that's like a sample size type thing. Like you're restricting only to a contingent. Yeah. Okay. So once again, even for the group of Germans, so once again, like as I've said before, with regard to the whole immediate massive spike of well-being versus a slow diffuse of reliable well-being. Same thing applies here. The universal principle doesn't just apply to everyone on the whole. It also applies to sample sizes of populations. So it would necessarily also apply to Germans to reliably increase their well-being, because it is a universal set of principles and laws. It does not apply to cases of agents that are sentient. That's the point. So it still reliably produces German well-being more so than simply sample sizing them and trying to derive their contingent happinesses.
I would agree. I do think I would agree. Like, I would say that, like, for example, like this is where Hegel would say the individual finds themselves in the objective. You know, the subjective finds
Sure.
themselves in the objective. Um, and it seems that the greater the subjective expression of individuals as a whole, the better. It's for Hegel. Freedom itself. I think it's somewhat Hegelian. I think the difference is that Hegel relates it to life and how we should act in the first place. And what I worry about this is that you tell us that I care about well-being. I'm like, okay, I care about well-being. Okay.
Yeah.
And that I should care about X, Y, and Z. And you tell us why I should care about X, Y, and Z. So you say, like, okay, you should care about that which is most desirable. It's most desirable because of the categorizations of desire. It's almost like what Hegel would say is almost a movement to absolute knowledge. The
Yeah.
comports of reason increase. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, we'll agree on that.
Good.
I'm just trying to. I mean, it's quite a similar argumentation to what I would argue, just put in a very different way.
Sure.
I'm just trying to make sure that you've got your bases here as well, because I mean, sometimes I mean, there's a lot of the variations of argumentation you'll come across when you're in these debates. I don't know if you've experienced many debates as a vegan.
Yeah,
You get
I
your
have.
egoists, you'll get your non-cognitivists, and I think
Yep.
you're fine with non-cognitivists and stuff like that. I think analytics, you'll probably do a great job. I think it's the egoists that are going to be a little bit confused. Like
I
they're
love.
gonna.
Yeah, I love the interesting types of arguments they can make because like only just recently, and this may sound like pretty sad, is I only just recently found that altruism is necessarily a constituent part of the total possibility for egoism, like altruism and the Hobbesian program, is it? I think.
Yeah, Hobbes is
Yeah,
it's well, I mean, it's not necessarily, it's like social contract theory.
yeah. Hobbesian is more social contract, but yeah, stuff like that. Impartiality in egoism actually is a thing. It's just that what makes egoism is the fact that its fundamental concept of well-being is hedonistic. That's what makes egoism egoism. That's
Yeah.
the thing that actually determines the difference between egoism and, say, for instance, eudaimonism and utilitarianism. Is the difference between hedonism. Hedonism is to eudaimonism what altruism is to utilitarianism. It has that impartiality thing, and it has that the outlook of self-concern type thing, and that's what differentiates them. That's interesting. But I wouldn't be able to say too much about the egoistic position because it does strike me as a perfectly defensible position to be an altruist if you hold to or at least partially. Like there may be some massive fundamental disagreements, but I haven't really explored it far enough to be able to draw these kinds of universal types of like, okay, this absolutely does not have the capacity to be sustained as a position. But that's what interests me
Well, I
about.
mean, arguably, eudaimonia is a form of egoism. I mean, it's
Yeah,
to find oneself within eudaimonia, it's not to leave yourself out. In fact, I mean, arguably, to exclude yourself would be immoral. I mean, that's the whole point, isn't it? Like virtue and happiness seem to be one and the same. The issue is that you'll find a lot of egoists go down this point where they'll go, okay, so okay. All right, well, here's what we're at. I'm going to do the
sorry,
Q
please.
and Q and A in a
I'll
second.
be right back in like 5 seconds.
That's okay. Yeah. So I'm going to do the Q and A in a minute. I hope this has been somewhat useful to individuals. I find his argumentation different to mine, similar. I think it's pretty interesting. Yeah, Shadow, I will get him on your Discord after. Has anyone got any questions for me and Darren here? I think he's done a great job. I think he's got a pretty good argument. I know, I imagine this drove you insane, but to be fair, it's just like talking to me, isn't it? I think his argumentation is quite similar to that, which I would experience in Hegel. I do find analytics difficult to follow at times. Yeah, he's a cool guy. I like him. I think his argumentation makes sense. And I would agree with it. It's almost like what I would do with Levinas and Hegel. I think he's just taking an analytic approach to the same conceptualization of moral good and why we should achieve overall moral good and eudaimonia. And I think he takes this idea of eudaimonia in the first place, which is why he talked about briefly about virtue ethics, but he didn't say he was a virtue ethicist. I'd say that the only thing that he could probably grow upon is, expressing these normative and applied ethical claims more clearly. But other than that, I think, I don't know if he would agree. Would you agree, Darren?
About?
I was just saying that the only thing I think we could improve upon is the expression of your normative and applied ethical claims. So, like, for example, being able to take your position and give a real life example for it. Because I think this is it's almost like the foundations of your position are the foundations of virtue ethics, and then virtue ethics would take us from this position to how we get to eudaimonia.
Okay, so the only reason I haven't really specialized in the application of normative ethics is because, one, philosophy does not take a top-down approach at all. It always takes a bottom-up approach. It starts off by meta-ethics and then moves to normative ethics, and then it moves to applied ethics only after those two in sequence have been successfully gone through. So
I would agree. I think it makes no sense to speak of good, for example, if we don't know what the good is. This is almost a linguistic problem before it's anything else, because it makes no. What we're talking about, we're talking two separate languages. Yeah,
that's right. To keep in mind the concept of fundamentality and what's more fundamental to what, and ontological dependence is extremely important. You have to know exactly what you're quantifying over in order to actually properly be able to say that you're definitively entailing this exact type of thing. Like an example of the type of entailment that we're talking about with philosophy is a stipulation or prescription. Once again, so in order to know that you're actually doing that in the first place, you need to know what you're ontologically committing yourself to. So the type of ontological commitment that you need to make is either an essentialist or a categorical / universalist. So that's exactly
Okay. Well, I think that's fair. I think you've given a good overview of your ethical system, and I
appreciate it.
I think as a continental, the way you describe things seems just very analytic, and I miss fancy words. But that's just personal preference. Like I like to be able to but I mean, other than that, like, I think you've done a great job. I think you've done a great job. Shadow wants to get you into his Discord. I think talking.
I don't have Discord, and I don't really intend on getting Discord. But I just want to say one thing about the whole idea of the continental, what's typically associated with continental, because there's no eternal line that marks the difference between analytic and continental philosophy. I'd say that on average, continentalists have a better conception of how to actually interpret, well, not necessarily interpret. Oh, that's probably because they actually continental philosophy contains hermeneutics, but so they're of course going to be really good at interpretation. But the whole idea of being able to express things in a way that is grounded in reality through metaphor, simile, or analogy, and two, being able to relate that back to the individual is a very special skill that most continental philosophers actually tend to have. And that's ultimately what I think marks a good philosopher, is their ability to express vividly the reality of certain concepts by using logically equivalent metaphors, similes, and analogies. That's ultimately, I think, the best way to do philosophy seriously.
I'm glad you think so. I'm glad you think so. Like, it's nice to hear people talk nicely about continental philosophy sometimes. Analytics tend to hate it a lot. Why you're so flowery? Would you please just put things simply? Normally, what you get? I mean, don't get me wrong. There is a place for analytic philosophy, I think, to be fair, and I think it's good that we'll have both options available to it now. I think, I think necessarily the rejection of continental philosophy by the original analytics is unjustified, but I don't think most analytics are like that now. I think a lot of the time we're just I think we just have a variation of ways about going about the same problems, and that's why we both do philosophy. We're just doing the same thing, just in different ways, and that's
One
pretty
thing
interesting.
that you pointed out. Sorry to interrupt. I know I'm doing that a lot. I'm so sorry. One thing that does need to be pointed out is that you cannot base philosophical conclusions on types of enumerative induction. You cannot definitively reach philosophy's conclusions or reach its products by simply using an inductive methodology. It's the only reason that you cannot do that is because the type of data philosophy actually studies cannot be enumeratively, inductively, reasoned.
Well, you just won't reach truth. You just won't reach truth, like, because what you're doing is you're attempting to prove a conclusion which has preceded its proof in the first place. So then you're always going to, rather than doing a dialectic or a logical syllogism, you're doing it backwards. You're doing it backwards, and it ends up being circular.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's the thing. You need to actually start, because when it comes to the data that falls within the purview of philosophy, you do actually have unadulteratable access to some of the data that philosophy actually studies, and that's through acquaintance knowledge and knowledge by pure description. Other than that, what we do to actually derive philosophical principles and stipulations is through conceptual analysis, and that's propositional knowledge. That's how we derive synthetic a priori knowledge in the first place. It's because we're starting from the point of the grounds, the acquaintance knowledge and knowledge by pure description, and working up from their entailments, because we do have unadulteratable access to acquaintance knowledge, because acquaintance knowledge is simply that which necessarily or categorically or extensionally falls within the purview of your very existential awareness.
Self-knowledge, as Aristotle puts it, and it's made what's the word? It's not only is it analytically true, it's a priori, because it's true by definition, but it's what's the word? It's
metaphysically necessary.
Sorry, what is it?
Metaphysically necessary is another one.
Yeah, but it's the way that it's we normally put it across is that it's
veridical.
It's essentially it's true by face value. Like, we cannot help but see it. We cannot help but appreciate it being there, which I think is fair enough. I can't remember the word I was looking for, but I'm sure it'll come back to us at some point 3 hours after this conversation. So
yeah, same. Yeah, I totally get that.
I think that's pretty much it. I think you've gave a good. I think it's a good way to defend veganism.
Oh, yeah.
The only thing I would say that you need to work on, I think your philosophy is great, especially for someone. Can you believe this guy's not doing a degree or anything in philosophy? I mean, he's done a lot of reading. Definitely should consider getting qualified in it. But I think the only thing you need to consider is just applied ethics.
Yeah, and that I'm saying, okay, so the way I've actually chunked my studies is that I've actually separated it into what I would say is pure and then applied. So pure is just basically meta ethics or just any sort of meta type discipline, and I split all three normative kind philosophical disciplines. So the three kinds are ontology, epistemology, and ethics. They're all normative kind because they're normative apt. They are to be brought to the light of prescription and stipulation. So I chunk them into meta and normative. So there is such things as like meta ontology and meta epistemology.
Yeah, there is.
Do exist. So it's best that we do study them so we have the best possible cross relationship. And the other way to do it is to understand what is fundamental to what. Is ontology more fundamental than epistemology? And is ethics more less fundamental than epistemology type thing? That's also another thing.
Continental looks at this very differently. It's almost like Schopenhauer, the problem of existence. Man understands himself as finite.
Sure.
And that leads to a problem of basically how he should live his life and so on like that. And that's what continentals kind of go down, and why probably we're more existential in nature, because we look at it from a humanist point of view, where we take like, okay, so we're in this situation, the starting place is right here, right now. How should I live my life? And I think analytic do what you just said. Okay, right, logic. How can we just found everything as much as possible? And I think that's really good. I think there's definitely some value there, because like logic is what we're both studying in many ways. Like, and the difference is, I think we definitely go down application just as much as like the meta almost, because I think there's value in both. I really do, and I think there is. I think that I could do with improving me metaphysics. I definitely could. I could definitely improve me metaphysics, because my God, I need to read more of that. And me meta ontology and me meta epistemology, I could probably do with improving, to be fair.
For sure.
And then I think on the other side, like, you could probably do with improving your applied philosophy. But I think that's literally just give and take, isn't it? Like, we can't study everything at the same time, because we're not all child prodigies learning books in 10 minutes. And like, oh, by the way, at the age of 11, my name's John Stuart Mill. At the age of 11, I just published like my first paper on utilitarianism. It doesn't work like that. We're not like weird ethical robots, but
I know a few people who could be defined by that.
But I'm happy to move on to the Q&A round if you are game.
I am definitely game. I'm more than happy with it.
Yeah. Thank you very much for coming on as well. I'd like to say that. Like, you've done a great job.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know how many people have actually put questions forward. Twisted Hippie says, will you bear his love children?
Come on, man, do it. Do it for the vine.
Donald Anderson asks you to create a YouTube channel,
or to
bring back your channel. And Shadow's begging us to put you in contact with him, because I think he's having a seizure. Okay, Shadow says, if my perfectionist well-being requires an imposition against another's perfectionist well-being and increased long-form suffering, should I hold to my own or not?
Hold on, could you wait, give me a second. How far along the line is this comment so I can read it myself and keep myself on track? Because I don't want to. There's no way in hell I'm gonna run the risk of strawmanning this guy.
Yeah. So this is. See if I can add timestamps. That is 2:44 p.m. on the top chat for me.
Okay.
I can also just copy. Yeah, you got it.
Could you copy and paste it into the? Sorry, I can't.
That's absolutely fine. No, that's absolutely fine. Sometimes it does it for me as well. I can't actually view certain things, so.
Yeah, I want to make sure I got an extra effort. Yeah. Okay. If my perfectionist well-being requires an imposition against another's perfectionist well-being and increased long-form suffering, should I hold to my own or not? Okay, so the whole point is, okay, so I think that's actually a really good question. Okay, so how do I approach this? So so perfectionist well-being is in and of itself it needs to have that aspect of having principled well-being production. Without it, without any sort of foundation or noble foundation that actually does directly connect to the production of well-being or to the very existence of well-being as a second order property, as in the objective sense, then if you don't hold to that, then yes, that would be a case where you do have to hold to someone who actually does contain that. But it's not a matter of holding to someone else's conception of perfectionism. It's literally the only thing that could differentiate a perfectionist a conception would be simply a situation or perspectival limitations. What do you know of a moral situation, and contrast it from what someone else knows about a moral situation in which there are multiple options to choose from. That is the determining factor of whether or not you should be holding to your own well-being, your own well-being.
I think sorry.
Yeah, I hope I'm not like.
No, I just think I think if I've continue. Actually, I'll jump in at the end. Sorry.
Sure. Yeah. So if it is a genuine theory, objective theory, of well-being that is perfectionist, it by definition, according to your epistemic and perspectival limitations, maximize the potential output of well-being by definition because of its prioritization of the essential components of the objective conception of well-being. That's So if there are more moral variables that you, this would be the only reason that you would have to dispense of your perspectival conception of perfectionism, is when someone else has more of an understanding of moral variables than you do, and that would be the only reason why yours would cause increased long form suffering. Say, for instance, that'd be the only reason, is if they have more understanding of the variables that are relevant in making moral decisions in the first place. So if you want me to specify anything, I am more than happy to go through the entire process, as exhaustive as you want to go.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think what I would like to say is, I think Shadow's giving you a scenario in which you can choose two people's possible scenarios. Both are rationally as justified based upon the amount of well-being produced. Like flourishing in general remains equal in all accounts. The only difference is it my flourishing or his flourishing? Do I survive or do they survive? In which case, I would say Hegel would call this a tragic scenario. He would say, well, actually, tragedy is not the confliction between right and wrong, but the confliction between two rights. He would say that there is actually no difference between choosing your well-being and choosing another well-being. The only thing that you could argue in this situation, and I think this is argued within, and I think would be held within, perhaps in a perfectionist account of well-being, would be that we have a moral duty to ourselves, and the expression of moral duty to ourselves would maximize well-being in the first instance, in which case one would be greater than the other in the first place. So it would be like Ross's the right and the good. The idea of doing the right is different to doing the good, only because by achieving one conception, by adhering to what's the word? Yeah, by adhering to a deontological structure, I can better fulfill a teleological goal. And in which case, you would be placing one as better than the other in any ways. So you would say, I should adhere to my own because it is more perfect. It's not because it's my own. It's because it's more perfect. And I think that's...
Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
And I think that's the only way that you could say that you could differentiate between choosing more A or B, because otherwise you could just flip a coin. Because what you've done then, and I think from your situation, is if all things are equal rationally, then there can be no differentiation between A or B. What you'd be saying is that it makes absolutely no difference. Choose A, choose B, based upon any other methodology you'd like to choose, because through the composites, the necessitates of reason have been met in both scenarios. At least that's how I would look at it.
Yeah, sufficient reason is another question. Like, say, for instance, once again, harkening back to that example that I was talking about the parasitic and pernicious types of effects of, say, for instance, quitting certain stuff cold turkey economically, and how that has a pernicious effect on the overall moral landscape of things. Perhaps enumerative induction of nets isn't actually the way to reliably produce well-being. So perhaps looking at only, does this in fact necessarily ontologically, epistemologically, etc., or mostly epistemologically necessarily comport to these foundational principles, in that they are ontologically committed to the essential constituent parts that comprise the objective conception of well-being. I guess that would be probably why, even in some cases, it might actually look like you're not producing as much well-being as another example. What it depends upon is the universal that does have a greater potential on the long haul, making room for more well-being to be experienced in the objective sense, not in the hedonistic sense.
Yeah. How would you feel about Shadow joining, just to ask you a couple of questions?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, would that be okay? Because I think he really I think if he's interested, because I think he's probably dying right now, and I can keep arguing his points for him, but I think he's just gonna get he says he'd debate you in a few hours. Well, I think, Shadow, you're welcome to. You don't have to. It's just because obviously someone suggested Shadow join. But if he's up for it, I mean, otherwise I can just keep. We can actually even call it. Yeah. I'm happy to say I think you've got a sound ethical theory. I think it's good, and I think it's very similar to my own. I think just the difference is the argumentation almost. the way that we
Mhm.
would argue. I would take, for example, the way that you talk about things being necessitated through reason and epistemology. I would take that back to language, and I would talk about the way language and reason and philosophy of mind.
I actually totally agree. I totally agree. Yeah, because that takes a
Um,
discussion of acquaintance and acquaintance knowledge and knowledge by description.
so yeah, I think we'll have very similar points. I would like to see you in more vegan debates, and maybe some rather than just some of the subjectivists that we see day to day.
Sure.
If you want to make a channel or anything. Shadow, did you want to join? You didn't say if you did or not.
So I'm guessing
There's
he's fully.
someone's screaming yes in the channel. That's a
Because I know there are a lot of people who are very, very committed to the idea of subjectivism. I was a subjectivist for a very long time. I was a very staunch subjectivist at that. But then as soon as you realize that you're actually not talking about a subject that can have prescriptive or stipulative power by having it. Okay, so actually, I have an argument that was actually written out. I was hoping to be able to use it. So ultimately, ontological subjectivity is incapable of producing prescriptively powerful logical systems due to it ontologically committing us to relative mental content and an arbitrary criterion that explodes into absurdity if we say that it is substantive in the stipulative or prescriptive sense. The other argument that I actually put forward was that ontological subjectivism commits us to the criterion that our arbitrary selection of contingent mental content that we simply favor over others is necessary and sufficient for producing the category morality. And this applies to both those who subscribe to the systems approach in universalism and everyone who subscribes to particularism in general. So
I would agree. Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, forces you into the principle of explosion or to just general logical absurdities for contradiction, because thusly every equally contradictory framework that simply adheres to this foundational meta ethic is thusly also the same category of things, even if they're equally contradictory. That's a massive.
I would say that's because we have to reject the language that we actually use. We are rejecting the necessitates of reason, and then when we do that, we're rejecting the justifications we can have to act one way or the other in the first place.
As soon as you reject the necessity of reason itself, you no longer can say that you're actually talking about a distinct category. You can't say that you're talking about an indiscrete category either, because there are no distinctive, defining, or generalizing factors that actually make it what it is, without also having to accept that what you mean by generalizable also means extremely wildly contradictory frameworks are equally representative of the same category of things.
So let's figure out why you're calling them contradictory.
Well, guys, actually, before you get into it and have at it for about, I'll give you about 5-10 minutes because I've got. But
well, then why'd you bring me in, Lewis?
Because you wanted to be in, and people were screaming for you to come in, and I think it'll be interesting seeing someone that's another more realist debate you, because I've already beat Shadow once,
Oh yeah. You had no answer to me.
Oh yeah. Anyway, but we'll get onto that in a minute. But he's got a very similar moral position, so it would be interesting to hear you two debate, because he doesn't use the flowery language I do, and it doesn't annoy you as much. So, if you would like to have at it, I'm going to quickly pop to the bathroom while Shadow puts forward his line of questioning. So, catch you in 5.
Sure thing. First of all, sorry?
If you don't mind, Darren.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. I actually want to say that I've seen you debate with him, and I actually do thoroughly enjoy the way that you actually go about discussing the subject. So yeah, props to you. I definitely see that you as being someone who's genuinely interested in the truth and not just simply designing their arguments to produce contradictions in your opponent. You actually want to seek truth, at least it seems. So
for sure.
Yeah. So
I do have to be a bit quiet.
Sorry?
I do have to be a bit quiet due to my time zone.
That's perfectly. Don't even worry about it. It's perfectly fine. Yeah.
Okay, so you seem to be talking about these contradictory frameworks, but what I'm hearing you describe sounds more like a double standard. For it to be contradictory, it sounds like you're stating that someone's affirming and denying a particular position, but I don't see how that would be the case if someone was, valuing the well-being or whatever kind you want to pick, hedonistic or perfectionist versions. If they were doing it for a subset of group and not for a different subset of group, that wouldn't be by definition a contradiction. It would just be a double standard.
Okay, so when I'm talking about a contradiction, I'm referring about logical extension. So let me just unpack that. So what I mean is ultimately that when you say that something, some criterion is necessary and sufficient for producing the foundations and the dictates for what falls within the purview of this specific distinct category, and that happens to produce extensionally contradictions that are equally representative, that is in and of itself what falls victim to the principle of explosion. It is
so fact, yeah, but that sounds like you have an assumed universal statement, a metric upon which you want to judge both things, but those aren't by necessary. Those aren't necessary to do so. You do not have to use that universal conception. The only thing we are forced to value is our own will.
We are, yeah, okay, so yep. So if you want to use will as, I guess, a substitute for intention or desire or anything like that, yeah, sure, I totally get that, yeah. Yeah, we aren't obligated though. There is no obligation. We just have that positive valuation. If you want to establish an obligation, you have to establish a prescription, because otherwise we're talking about completely separate things. So
no, I would say it's a description. I can't do otherwise. I cannot go against my own values. They are what drive me.
Sure,
so
sure,
I'm not prescribing them to myself.
You can.
As if there's something outside of myself that steps out and says, hey, me, do this thing. No, of course not. This is what I am. So, yeah, and this is what I'm necessarily entailed to. But why would that make me have to value other people's values in such a same light? And why would that be contradictory if I'm not using this universal of well-being?
Okay, so let's take that back a little bit. So I hope I haven't lost this so far. I'm pretty drained. It's almost midnight. I'm really sorry if I'm not going to be debating up to par, but I really do. I would love to continue this discussion some other time, though.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So if you could repeat just the general crux of your point, I just want to make sure that I understand each individual point, like premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. I want to exactly, totally understand what you're getting.
Well, I didn't quite write it into a syllogism, but my point was that, well, we are forced by description, by definition, to follow our own will, because that is what we are. There's no us outside of us to prescribe back to us what we should do, as if there were a blank slate that we could have derived our desires from. So by definition, we follow what we are, and that is what we call ourselves. But
yeah,
and for me to value someone else's value by necessity would require that there is a necessitative universal statement
okay, so
that I am judging by, but I don't understand how you're getting there other than presupposition.
Okay, so it's not presupposition. It's literally the expression of an essential connection between essential constituent parts of a propositional intentional state and what that propositional intentional state is about. If we cannot dispense of the propositional intentional state, then we also cannot dispense about what it is about. So because those two things are hand in hand. So in the case of the propositional intentional state desire, which you're referring to as will, or at least as a subsection of that intentional state, will. I don't see that as being something that you necessarily comport to, because positive valuation is not necessarily indispensable. You can dispense of certain positive valuations. So it doesn't have a one-to-one correspondence with urgency, with action urgency.
Are we still talking from within the subject?
Sorry?
Are we still talking from within the subject?
Okay, so so what are your skeptical worries about regarding me not being in the same subject?
No. I was wondering if you were making this description about a specific subject, or whether this was a universal conception between people.
This would be a universal conception, not between people, but of
people.
So it's not. I wouldn't even say of people. I would say that is of this particular second order property that happens to be essential in producing minds in the first place. So it's categorical, an extension that actually does comprise the overall higher order property that is the mind itself. And for all cases that minds exist, then these are necessary categories that have to comprise it, because otherwise it cannot have the extensional property that makes a mind in the first place. Now, this is I know that's a mouthful, and it needs to be. It
No, I might agree with it.
It begs the question. It begs the question, though. It does beg the question, though. So what I need to actually do is explain to you why exactly the mind is like it does have these essential constituent parts, and
No, that's
why
fine.
exactly.
I can take that into the argumentation. It doesn't matter. I can accept that.
But
But the point is that we each have an individual drive.
Yep.
And you're saying that my conception of well-being must be the maximization of all well-beings. But I don't see why that's the case. That's the only leap that I'm not understanding.
Okay, so
now,
so
I agree with you what a desire is. I agree that that's part of what a mind is. But now why does my mind have to value any other mind other than its own?
Okay, so as I said, go ahead. Yeah, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, it seems to be your argument is every time you're asked that is to just say that it's a categorical understanding of what well-being is. But that doesn't seem to address why I actually have to care about that.
Okay, so because you care about your own well-being, and it's not because that well-being is located within you, it's because you are literally valuing well-being. You aren't valuing the location. You're valuing the well-being as it is in that location. It's incidental.
How do you prove that?
Incidental. Yeah, so because you're valuing well-being itself, that means you're talking about that.
You're saying I am. Why do I believe that?
What do you believe? I'm saying that
you're saying I'm valuing the category well-being, which would enforce me to value all well-being. Prove that.
Mm-hmm.
Prove that statement.
Okay, so due to the fact that desires are in fact propositional attitude states that are comprised of the necessary, essential constituent conditions of action urgency and action urgency out of the push towards deriving well-being, and well-being as in the general scope, you cannot dispense of the particular categorical value of well-being if you are to value well-being in the first place. There is no way around it. You actually have a categorical imperative, if you want to put it in the Kantian terms, if you are to value well-being in any conception, whatever conception of well-being that happens to be the crux or the underpinnings of what can reliably reproduce well-being is thusly something that you ought to value out of necessity of you valuing any particular type of well-being in the first place.
It's like I understand the argument, but I don't see the proof for it.
Okay, so
it seems very well that I could just not value the category of well-being and value my own category of well-being because it doesn't seem to necessarily entail it.
That's right, because like when I'm talking about prescription, I'm not saying that like okay, so you ought to value the objective objective conception of well-being, therefore you value the objective conception of well-being. The thing about it is you can doubt ad infinitum, but it doesn't mean the doubt has prescriptive value or that the doubt hasn't in and of itself been epistemically satisfied. That's one of the things you can do. You can choose to avoid accepting something that is like sufficient and necessarily produced reason-wise, but like it doesn't have any prescriptive power to doubt that, or any stipulative power to say that, yeah, your doubt does in fact represent the skeptical worries of reality. It could just be you're just reporting your own intentional states. And why
would I need to do more than that?
Why would you need to do more than that? Because your intentional states are in fact about something that's external to your intentional states.
So I mean, I can give you hypothetical, imperatives as towards my intentional states. Still doesn't require me to have a categorical understanding.
Sure. Okay. So ultimately, the argument I want to put forward, and I think I'll end it there. I know how it looks. But it's almost midnight.
I mean, to be fair, I would like to put forward for Darren here. He's 8 hours ahead of me, and he did wait on for me, who had a delay.
No, it's totally cool. Don't worry about it. I know you just finished a long debate or a long discussion with Lewis, so don't worry about it.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. But thus far, I've very, very thoroughly enjoyed it. But the discussion between you and me. But like, I want to complete. Like, I want to make sure that you're not left on a cliffhanger, or that you're not left feeling unsatisfied, or that your question hasn't been satisfied. Okay, so if you could restate the kind of the skeptical worry that you had for me, I'd be more than happy to give you a final good response, I guess.
If I may, just
Yeah,
kind
sure.
of jump in for you, Darren. I don't understand, Shadow, how you could say that you could. I know very well you could value something that is a particular, but that's all well and good. You could value that particular thing, but then it doesn't meet the requirements of why you started valuing in the first place and how to meet that end. Because the whole point of valuing is that you're valuing towards something, you're valuing towards an end goal to achieve happiness,
Sure.
even in,
I mean,
in an egoistical way. So,
I mean, me and you already previously agreed to this, that, you
yeah,
know,
yeah, we have.
a conception that it is a long form goal. But what we didn't agree is that the epistemic justification required other people to sign off on it. And
Well, why? Well, how wouldn't it? Because I mean, what version of truth do you adhere to, Darren? Just quickly.
A correspondence theory of truth.
so he's definitely correspondence. I can hear it when he first started.
You see,
Yeah.
I would even say through coherence. I think his position's justified. I think because I think coherence leads to correspondence anyway.
Well, I would argue that all day.
Well, you even said that other people inside of your mind. You even said to me, Shadow, that for example, the validity of a situation, you would agree, is determined by more than one person, and the individual should.
No, it doesn't have to be.
Well, it doesn't have to be, but you would say that the existence of another individual within, let's say, an idealist scenario, at all,
Sure,
would then be a greater correspondence to truth itself in the first place.
Well, greater coherence.
Coherence, sorry, not correspondence. My bad.
You mean
So the more people who verify the epistemics of it, the greater the likelihood.
Oh no, that would be more of a correspondence.
That would
because
also be
that if I have 3 people and the 3 people are coherent, it's just the same as having 5 people who are all coherent. It's just one more chance of being less coherent.
Well, that's what coherence is probability.
Wait, hold on. Why are we taking an inductive approach to determining what truth is? Isn't the very action of determining what truth is supposed to be deductive in order to actually exact that it is in fact what truth is?
Yeah,
no, I
exactly.
wouldn't.
Okay, so
I don't think we can have ultimate truth.
But yes, I think the point is that Aristotle would argue that your first position is always inductive. So I'm not interested necessarily in saying. You see, no, I think so. I don't think you are born with a value that is given to you tabula rasa of the good. You are born with a position to achieve a good, and this is desiring. And what when you
be able to achieve good, and I think that is just as a result of when, in fact, is that inductive time. When in fact and it's the essential property of sentience actually does develop and produce these constitutive propositional attitude states that actually do comprise what a mind is. Only that's when first and foremost we actually do develop these foundational inerrant truths, which are just simple extensions of our own very awareness. And awareness in and of itself requires existence of awareness and awareness of awareness in order to be itself. So these types of things in and of itself, when they are in fact the case, can be inherently known because they are reflexive properties. So that's, I would actually say, as soon as these propositional attitude states actually do develop in a sentient mind, as soon as that happens, they have now got cases of maybe tacitly known acquaintance knowledges and knowledges by description. And these are, in fact,
I agree. It's all self-evident. You don't have a choice but to know it.
Yeah, I think we'll all agree on that. The only thing I'm saying is that how are you going to take them from coherence to correspondence? Because what you've said there is that you cannot help but correspond to the mind in which you're in. I think pretty much it's like kind of like Hegel. You look at your lens through your lens. For the phenomenology of mind, you are understanding that situation.
But if you're going to go from correspondence of the mind, you're saying the mind is what reality is. coherence doesn't require you to say that.
It's your reality, though, isn't it, Charlie?
Yeah, it just says that that is a constitutive part of how reality actually is. But that in and of itself is erring on dodgy territories. We're starting to delve into causal explanation and temporal explanation, which is not philosophical. That is scientific, and we can't establish these types of scientific approximations of truth. We delved into the philosophical deduction and
scientific does not pop out of philosophy. What are you talking about?
Excuse me?
Science is philosophy.
Oh god. Okay, so then we first have, in order to actually establish this fact, we need to understand what creates these research disciplines in the first place. And if you want to dispute the fact that they're both distinct research disciplines, present your argument. That they aren't distinct research disciplines.
That they aren't distinct? I never said that they were distinct. I said they were both within the category of philosophy.
Oh, so they're both okay. So then we actually agree. Never mind. What was your argument? Your position regarding science's relationship to philosophy?
I'm just saying science is a type of philosophy.
I agree.
It is a perspective upon which to categorize your experiences. Which is no different than talking about your experiences.
Yeah, and I think to be fair, like when I look at something, let's say, I don't know, the science of right, as Hegel puts forward, he's not necessarily using a scientific method in the atypical sense. He's not using that kind of methodology. What he is saying is that it is a very similar foundation in which, for example, if they're both a philosophy, and since you both agree they are, that the necessitates of reason are changed in each scenario. And he says thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Now, the synthesis for one thesis antithesis relationship will be the thesis for another. It will be the end point for one theory is the beginning of another, especially in analytic philosophy, where we tend to say, for example, top down. We'll go like meta, and then we take ourselves through.
I'd actually consider that a bottom-up approach. I would assume that science actually is distinct from philosophy in that it incidentally takes a top-down approach in comparison to philosophy's bottom-up approach. You have to start off with your knowledge of the transcendental data that philosophy studies in order to work up and actually produce stipulations for what types of transcendental data is real and does portend existence.
We can all agree scientists do half the job. Like they start off and they assume things that we can't get away with assuming.
Yeah, like is the uniformity of nature.
Yeah,
they start off with that when they work from local to global or global to local, macro to macro, macro to macro.
Right. I still think that fits within coherence, because it would just say that my memories of such are coherent to each other, and that if I explore within this way, it would be within the same framework of my understanding, whether true or not ultimately.
But I think this is the thing, like I don't think there's any problem here, because it seems to me like you're like the reason I said that coherence will force correspondence is literally just because I think both of them are evaluations of a reality, and I think the only difference between coherence and correspondence tends to be pointed out in relation to the mind reality distinction. And I think
the only thing about it is coherence doesn't exhaust to cases like that are cases of reflexivity. Coherence is mostly it doesn't apply to acquaintance knowledge like the correspondence theory does. Correspondence theory includes foundational acquaintance and knowledge by description types of knowledge, whereas the coherence theory only permits of propositional knowledge because it is non-basic, whereas the correspondence theory includes non-basic and fundamental and foundational acquaintance and stuff.
True by description. Something can be true by description, just by acquaintance. That word will come back to us. I cannot remember what the hell it is, but self-evident. But it's like a word for self-evident that's just left.
Self-evident to me, that just sounds question begging.
Well, I mean, come on. When we're talking about, for example, the phenomenological experience of good, if you give me something that's not, you
There
give me
should
something
be a
that.
necessary metaphysical explanation for that.
Why?
There should, because otherwise it's insufficient to actually produce there being reliable knowledge. Self-evidence just seems to be an arbitrary selection of certain things. It doesn't, like in other words, a very an ultra particular.
I feel
case.
like this is where
this is where I
you're
diverge
going to fight.
I know why I diverge from most people, because I'm actually looking for an inerrant, complete framework, a complete from point A to point B in the literal sense, like from an actual absolute foundation, moving all the way up from that. I'm looking for.
You already have that. It's you.
Yeah, it is the is. That's what it is.
That is your foundation.
It's what cannot be doubted in a Cartesian.
Beyond that.
Okay, so being able to find a non-arbitrary criterion for determining the kind of thing.
Is that arbitrary?
Exactly. Okay, so just to simply say that is self-evident.
Okay, so if I was to say existence itself is self-evident, how is that arbitrary?
Okay, so what your criterion for self-evident just seems to be, it strikes me as, I could be wrong. Please don't take this as me actually saying this is my position, because I know this could sound stupid.
No, I don't think you're stupid, please.
I'm actually trying to learn this myself. So when you say self-evident, what do you mean?
That if I am it, I can say something about it, by definition. I cannot escape the fact that I am that experience.
Okay, so is that your criterion for self-evidence?
Yeah.
I would say, if I was to maybe flesh it out a bit, I would say that it would be an expansion of the of Cartesian doubt, that which cannot be doubted.
Yeah, sure. So, like, what my question would be how exactly do we establish a non-arbitrary criteria or criterion of self-evidence in such a way that cannot be wrong? How do we establish that? So of course it would have to be self-contained.
Okay, but then you're going. I feel like then what you're going to say is we're going to get to the point in which I doubt that which cannot be doubted, and then you go, okay, well, can you doubt reason?
Okay,
then how do you then?
Yeah, my response to that would be, say, for instance, like your doubt of that would be in and of itself. It has zero prescriptive power, because you can, like, for the same reason.
I could doubt my ability to doubt.
Yeah, you can.
This is the argument against skepticism, typically.
Yeah. You're
now being used against me, who argues against skepticism.
Yeah,
I'm skeptical about everything, but that.
That's epistemic. That's epistemic anti-realism. That's a metaphysical anti-realist position. Okay.
Yeah.
I fundamentally reject that, but if we do, we have to say that it's self-evident. If we don't say that metaphysics itself is self-evident, we are in hell. Like,
I know.
Where are you going to prove metaphysics, man? That is an actual, like, we can't keep going up.
Yeah, man. I think there is something to be said about treating properties as in and of themselves immediately accessible to our very perceptual existence. Like, okay, so I ultimately I just don't know. I want to see if it is possible to create a truly foundational and irreducible framework.
You'd have to reject fallibilism. You'd have to reject fallibilism.
Yeah, I want to be able to reject fallibilism. But in what sense? Hold on. Let me just qualify this. In what sense would I be rejecting fallibilism?
Because what you'd be saying is that you can prove that you have the metaphysical foundations for you to be able to prove that you have the metaphysical foundations.
Yeah, pretty much. That's literally the kind of thing that I'm looking for. I would say that's exactly the most accurate way to describe it. I don't know how to describe it, and that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for that kind of thing. That's the type of thing that we're talking about, or at least what I'm talking about when I'm trying to say that I'm looking for an actualized grounds for all possible frameworks that are in fact truth apt, reality apt, existence apt, subsistence apt, inerrant. In other words, something that is necessary, that absolutely out of necessity comports to the only possible conception
But then I'll just respond, why? What do you mean by necessary? Like, if I was to say, you say logical, if you say logical necessary, and I can doubt logic, then it can't be that. So then we're gonna have to find some other way for it to be necessary.
Yeah, so it does lead us down this type of regressive route. But the thing about it is, absolutely, I want to put emphasis on the fact that it's necessary to go down that route to find out the real limitations that we have to actually garnering the truth of things. So that way we can produce arguments that do in fact successfully convince others for the right reasons, not just simply because we've just found a very objective sociological
regardless, I can make the same argument by saying that reason has to exist because we couldn't argue without it.
That's the thing. I want to bring up this subject as being very content. I don't want to like defend any position on it. I want to bring up the subject and express that it is actually extremely important. Like I can
understand why you're doing it. I mean, good for you.
Why not just say reason is true because you're doing it right now?
I think
how are you going to argue against that?
See, that's where we agreed in the first place, because I was like, all right, because you said desire, it's a necessitation, it urges you forward. I'm like, yeah, okay, that's the starting point. But your starting point's way before that. Your starting point is like my starting point really is like maybe like what we are and the self-evidence of being. And your starting point is like, okay, well, there's what we are, right? But then there's what we are.
Might as well put this into context. Ultimately, what I'm looking for is an actual answer, an actualized,
it's great. It's honestly like
that does in fact logically defeat and metaphysically defeat such positions as like presuppositionalism, which it would do incidentally.
Well, I think presuppositionalism is awful in the first. I mean, the only thing that you have to accept for this.
People don't give presuppositionalism the credit it actually does deserve for bringing forward a very strong type of Pyrrhonian skepticism. People don't actually find satisfactory answers to them, and that's actually a massive problem. They are stupid positions, but only in the positive sense. In the negativistic sense, it is just as strong as soft solipsism. It is that
lost in language.
You see, I think to be entirely honest with you, as soon as like somebody tries to give me an argument in which tries to defy their argument in the first place, I think what they're talking is nonsense. I would say that it's a linguistic fault more than anything.
I don't know if presuppositionalism or soft solipsism necessarily does that though.
I think presuppositionalism does, because I would say that if
what's wrong with solipsism?
I think soft solipsism is defensible.
Yeah,
but I think
is completely debunkable.
I think I would take a view in which would be quite Hegelian, in the sense I would say what is the individual isn't an individualist conception in the first place. The I exists independent of what we see as the subject. But anyway, the point is that that's with just solipsism. But if we go back to just metaphysics or metaphysics, I think the issue is that any argument you're going to put forward is going to hit that doubt. I can't see a way that you could put forward an argument which can.
So the type of argument I'm looking for is one that exhausts all possible cases of substantive doubt, not insubstantive doubt or types of doubt that could literally be completely prescriptionless, or that has absolutely zero meaning to it. Could just simply be a description of, that would be, in other words, just simply a description of your contingent mental content. I'm looking for something that exhaustively defeats all possible cases of actual substantive types of skepticism. And I'd like to actually say that there is a separation between doubt and proper skepticism. So when I'm saying we're looking for a solution to the problem of skepticism, there has to be a substantive and exhaustive universal methodology for exhaustively deflating, logically defeating the type of substantive doubt that I'm referring to. That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for an inherent way to derive that as well.
Do you think that it makes sense to be an epistemic anti-realist?
No, I don't think so.
No. Okay, I would agree.
Yeah.
I think mainly because
I do respect Pyrrhonian skeptics because they come up with some fucking really interesting arguments.
But I think the issue is they have to keep coming up with arguments, don't they? The issue is they have to keep coming up with arguments.
Yeah, that's it. And I think that can be really creative. Like just like continental philosophers, they can be quite creative about it. They can start to use all kinds of different metaphors and like thought experiments, and that's where they're really good at experimental philosophy. Perennial skeptics, smarter than people give.
I just don't see that as a foundation for presuppositionalism. I think people like Aristotle would say, like, logic is necessitated. Book 9, what was it? No, Aristotle, book Gamma, I think it is actually, where he says, where he puts forward this, like, where he basically says, well, if you don't accept logic, then everything you says is not, everything you say will be nonsensical.
Sure.
Every argument you use will be determined by the laws of logic. You'll try and defend them using the laws of logic, and you've already rejected the laws of logic, so you kind of you're not actually speaking.
That's what we have to draw a very big distinction between metaphysical explanation and also propositional knowledge and acquaintance or knowledge by description. We have to make a distinction between those three classes of knowledge, because they are in fact distinct.
But do you not think you could get to the same position as that you're trying to achieve just by I'm gonna have to go now myself, actually. But
yeah, sure.
Just by saying something that language necessitates reason, the laws of non-contradiction and so on, law of identity are linguistic in essence. And if you want to convey meaning itself, you cannot have meaning.
I would say if you're having an at-hand experience, if such a thing makes sense, and it has quantities, then you already have abided by them.
Yeah, it's conceptualization. I would take a philosophy of mind.
Okay, so because logic itself is literally existential quantification over like predicates, propositions, modalities, all this kind of stuff, it is ultimately 100% grounded in existential quantification. So it requires this whole primacy of existence, or if you want to properly conceive it, a primacy of reality or a primacy of being. So if that's what derives these consistencies throughout logic, and thusly we get the 3 laws of logic, then we can say that these 3 laws of logic derive themselves out of this property that we refer to as existence. But we can know existence inherently because existence is in fact a property of our basic existential awareness. And because awareness is reflexive, it can also know the subcategorical properties that awareness itself is comprised of, which includes existence. So therefore we can know what existence is. So that kind of argument, something along those lines.
I might disagree with the end point, but I agreed with everything else leading up to it.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we'll have a problem here, to be honest. I don't think any of us do. I think very rarely we'll meet skeptics that go this hard.
Except people like Darth Dawkins, if you guys have come across them.
I've met Darth Dawkins.
Yeah, I tried to explain self-evidence and he kicked me within about 10 seconds, so...
Yeah, and that's the thing. Self-evidence doesn't always seem to come across as being something that is satisfactory.
Okay, yeah, but I would just say he's being irrational, to be entirely honest with you. I don't think it's not that he's being a skeptic. It's just that he's defying reason.
Hold on. That is just literally a deflationary response. That could be deemed as just simply that you're selecting arbitrarily your mental content to determine that he's just not worth your time. That to me sounds like
that he rejects language itself. I would say that the words and significations he uses is literally nonsensical. I would say that because of what language means, that his arguments...
You have to explicate that sufficiently.
Yeah, I would just say that he's breaking the rules of a language game. He's talking of time without context.
You have to say...
in Augustine.
And in order to say that he has to...
We've all got together and we've decided we don't like Darth Dawkins.
Sorry?
I said we've all agreed we're all against Darth Dawkins.
I personally, I think he's actually it's like a love-hate relationship. I've watched his stuff. Like I've actually had a few interactions with him. We didn't like end on very positive terms type stuff. But I honestly, it's like a love-hate relationship. I love the kinds of stuff that he gets like skeptics and atheists to do. Like they get more creative about how exactly to approach this exact type of skepticism, but also how exactly to respond to the general problem of skepticism. I think that is so important to us advancing as a species, because all problems in society can be boiled down to being either a lack of wisdom or just an inability to sufficiently respond to cases of skepticism, whether that be about skepticism about like the true nature of things or skepticism about how exactly we're going to achieve our goal.
But it's self-refuting. I mean, you end up being so skeptical that your skeptical argument becomes paradoxical. So
How?
you can't because you've defied reason, and then you use reason to defy reason. That's the point. Like, because you're speaking the words, the meaning in which you are adhering to the law of identity in the first place.
When you're skeptical of reason itself, you're like, ultimately there of course, there are two ways of going about being skeptical of reason itself. There's the way of being skeptical of reason in the sense of the grades of involvement of metaphysics and conceptual analysis, which either takes us down the idea that we just simply don't know what actually does in fact create reason or necessitate reason in the first place. But then there's the other one which just says that I just doubt there is the possible prescriptive capacity of reason itself, which is probably the one that you're referring to. I'd be referring to a skepticism about reason that's not denying of its applicability or of its necessity, but just simply asking the question, how exactly and why exactly is reason, in the way it's conceived, necessary and universal? So it is fundamentally.
I see what you're going for.
Approach.
I think that's valuable. I can see the value in that.
Extremely valuable. Yeah, because that kind of stuff form the basis for stuff like normative ontology, which is exactly what the subject that literally studies things like how we can reliably produce and reproduce innovations in general, regardless of what it is about, but also how to absolutely and inherently optimize systems in general as well.
You are going to end up in an infinite regress of sufficient reason, though, yeah?
I don't know about that. I think there is a foundation. There would have to be, like, say, for instance, if there's a sequence of reasonings, then there has to be one ultimately that it actually is, or correspondent to, or coherent to, however we want to go about that. So the thing about it is you can't avoid the fact that you have to be coherent to something that is essentially necessary to be the case in general. The only thing that can facilitate that task, I think, is reality itself. Which is why we could actually start to delve into discussion.
I agree.
Reality operator, which operates over that exact thing that I'm talking about.
But I think is that not where we would basically say, okay, reality itself exists, but my understanding of reality
exists. What we say is reality is itself.
Okay, yeah, reality is itself. But I mean, like, it's linguistic. It's linguistic. But I mean,
there's a big difference between linguistic and metaphysical. Linguistic is reportive, metaphysical is stipulative. There has to be a distinction there.
I completely agree. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that I agree with where you're going. Actually, I think it's very interesting. You're basically trying to necessitate the laws of logic, which is bravo. You know, I think that's bold for any mere mortal to achieve. You know, you know, let us know how you do.
That's ultimately one of my goals in life. I actually want to see if I can solve the problem of skepticism. I know it sounds like a pipe dream, but I think this is one of the things I actually do have faith in being able to solve. And I think that kind of drive is
the right word.
What word?
Yeah.
The word choice.
Sorry?
That's quite the word choice.
I know.
Well, you know, like, genuinely, mate, you may prove all wrong, literally, in every single scenario.
The only reason I say that it is, like, the reason I say it's based on faith is not necessarily because it's based on faith. It's literally a case of the second grade of metaphysics involvement in conceptual analysis, which is just to understand that there is an a priori property that we are all ontologically committed to when we make any statement. There is one ultimacy. There has to be an absolute to which we are, in fact, contingently reliant upon in order to derive truth statements in the first place. There has to be one that's univocal across the board, absolutely, in order for there to be the capacity for there being reliable statements, and for there to be the capacity of existence being uniform in the the place.
I'm gonna have to.
I don't understand any of that.
I agree. But this is the thing. I think this is where I can't help but say that you're gonna end up with just an is, because that is essentially what you're describing. You're describing the is. Just it necessitates because it is. I have to go now. I really have to go.
Yeah, sure,
It's been really interesting. It's been really interesting, and I was really happy to have you on, Darren. And thank you again, Shadow, for popping by.
Hey, no problem.
Right.
Perfect. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much, Darren. Sorry for keeping you up so late, and really appreciate it. Sound ethical theory. Your metaphysics is terrifying. But I'm going to go now, and I hope you all have a nice day.
See you, Liz.
See you guys.